Chronic self-doubt. Chronic self-doubt is one of the most corrosive psychological patterns a person can fall into because it slowly erodes confidence and convinces you that you are fundamentally incapable, unworthy, or inadequate. At its core, it is the unrelenting inner voice that whispers, "You are not good enough, no matter what you accomplish." This toxic whisper makes victories feel hollow, achievements feel undeserved, and failures feel like proof of your deepest fears. Unlike temporary uncertainty, chronic self-doubt is a constant storm that shapes your entire worldview, making you second-guess every decision, every word, and every step you take. This state of mind is not born overnight. It grows silently from repeated criticism, traumatic experiences, perfectionist tendencies, or being raised in environments where nothing you did was ever enough. Over time, the voice of self-doubt becomes louder than your own intuition. Even when evidence of your capability is undeniable, you still look for cracks, still search for the reasons you don't deserve success. What makes chronic self-doubt so devastating is not just the hesitation it creates, but the opportunities it steals. You hesitate before pursuing dreams, sabotage relationships because you assume you are unworthy of love, and shrink in the face of possibility because you are terrified of failure. Your brain begins to associate action with danger, replaying worst-case scenarios as if they are inevitable. This constant self-questioning leads to paralysis, where inaction feels safer than risking exposure. The tragedy is that chronic self-doubt convinces you to cage yourself while holding the key in your hand. It doesn't just stop you from reaching your potential. It convinces you that you never had any to begin with. Fear of abandonment. Fear of abandonment is one of the most painful psychological wounds because it convinces you that love is always temporary, that connection is fragile, and that people will eventually leave no matter what you do. At its core, it is the constant dread that those you care about will disappear, whether through rejection, betrayal, or indifference. And this dread shapes how you love, how you trust, and how you live. It makes every silence feel threatening, every delay in response a rejection, every argument a sign that the end is near. You begin to walk on eggshells, molding yourself into what you think others want, terrified that if you show too much need, too much emotion, or too much of your true self, you'll be left behind. This fear is often born from early wounds. Parents who were emotionally unavailable, inconsistent caregivers, or experiences where love was conditional, withdrawn when you didn't measure up. Those experiences leave scars that whisper, "I am not enough to be loved," permanently. As adults, the fear resurfaces in relationships, where even genuine love is filtered through suspicion. You cling tighter, try harder, or sacrifice your own needs just to keep people close, yet the very intensity of this fear often pushes them away. It is a cruel cycle. The more you try to prevent abandonment, the more abandoned you feel. The fear becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. You interpret normal distance as rejection, healthy boundaries as neglect, and minor conflicts as signs of abandonment. The wound deepens with every false alarm until love feels less like comfort and more like a countdown to loss. This fear doesn't just haunt relationships, it haunts your sense of safety, leaving you always bracing for the moment when everything you love slips away. Emotional dependency. Emotional dependency is a hidden chain that binds your happiness, worth, and stability to the presence, approval, or affection of another person. At its core, it is the inability to feel whole unless someone else validates your existence. Every moment apart feels unbearable, every silence feels threatening, and every shift in mood from the other person dictates whether your day is filled with light or drowned in despair. It is the slow erosion of selfhood, where your own needs, desires, and identity are buried beneath the overwhelming need to be loved and reassured. This dependency often begins when love or acceptance in childhood was conditional, inconsistent, or absent. When you grow up believing that you must cling tightly to keep people close, adulthood becomes a battlefield of desperate attachment. You pour everything into others, convincing yourself that if you give enough, sacrifice enough, or prove yourself enough, they won't leave. Yet, the cruel paradox is that this very intensity suffocates relationships. Emotional dependency breeds fear, fear of being abandoned, fear of not being enough, fear of living without the other person. That fear becomes obsession, making you read into every text, every word, every sigh, as if your survival depends on it. What makes emotional dependency so destructive is how it convinces you that you cannot stand alone. You stop trusting your own strength and instead outsource your stability to someone else's presence. When they are happy, you feel alive. When they withdraw, you collapse. It is a cycle that drains both you and the relationship, turning love into possession and connection into control. Over time, you lose yourself entirely, confusing dependency for devotion when in reality, it is a quiet surrender of your freedom and your soul. Constant people-pleasing is a silent poison that disguises itself as kindness, but slowly destroys your sense of self. At its core, it is the relentless need to be liked, approved of, or accepted, even if it means betraying your own needs, silencing your own voice, or living a life that isn't yours. Every yes you say when you want to say no chips away at your identity, leaving you a hollow reflection of what others expect. It feels safer to bend, to accommodate, to please, because deep down, you believe that love is something earned, not something you deserve simply by existing. This compulsion often comes from childhood environments where approval was conditional, where love was given only when you were good or when you put others first. You learned early that to keep peace, you must silence your own desires. As an adult, that pattern becomes your prison. You stay quiet when boundaries are crossed. You agree when your gut screams against it. You smile when you want to cry. And while people may admire your helpfulness, inside you are exhausted, resentful, and empty. What makes constant people-pleasing so destructive is not just a loss of authenticity, but the belief that your worth is tied to how useful or agreeable you are. Over time, you forget who you are without others' demands shaping you. Relationships become lopsided, filled with silent resentment, because while you give everything, you rarely feel truly seen. And the cruelest part? No matter how much you give, it never feels like enough. People-pleasing doesn't guarantee love. It only guarantees that you disappear in the process. Difficulty setting boundaries. Difficulty setting boundaries is one of the most dangerous psychological red flags because it leaves you wide open to exploitation, burnout, and emotional collapse. At its core, it is the inability to say no when your soul is screaming for rest, the hesitation to protect your space when others are draining it, and the fear of disappointing people even when their demands crush you. You let others take pieces of you, one request, one favor, one intrusion at a time, until there is nothing left but exhaustion and quiet resentment. This struggle often stems from growing up in environments where your needs were dismissed or punished, where love was conditional, or where self-sacrifice was seen as virtue. You learn to equate compliance with safety and silence with survival. As an adult, the pattern repeats itself, agreeing when you want to refuse, enduring mistreatment because confrontation terrifies you, and convincing yourself that protecting your boundaries makes you selfish or unlovable. What makes this so devastating is the slow erosion of your identity. Without boundaries, you become what others need instead of who you truly are. You carry the weight of everyone else's problems, neglecting your own, while secretly hoping someone will notice the pain you're too afraid to voice. The absence of boundaries doesn't just hurt you, it poisons your relationships. Resentment builds silently, intimacy becomes distorted, and your self-worth sinks lower with every line you fail to draw. The tragedy of difficulty setting boundaries is that it teaches you to tolerate the intolerable, to accept what breaks you, and to believe that silence is safer than self-respect. In reality, every time you fail to draw a line, you teach others that you don't have one. Over-apologizing is a psychological wound disguised as politeness, but beneath the surface, it reveals a deep fear of rejection, conflict, and unworthiness. At its core, it is the reflex to say, "I'm sorry," for things that don't require forgiveness, apologizing for existing, for taking up space, for asking questions, for needing help, even for things completely out of your control. Every apology feels like a shield, a desperate attempt to keep others from being upset with you, but the more you do it, the more it reinforces the belief that you are always wrong, always at fault, always the problem. This habit is often born from growing up in environments where mistakes were punished harshly, where love or safety depended on compliance, or where conflict felt dangerous. You learn to apologize as a survival strategy, a way to shrink yourself to avoid disapproval. As an adult, that instinct lingers like a shadow, making you anticipate anger even when none exists. You say sorry for bumping into someone, for asking for something basic, for speaking your mind until the word loses meaning and your voice loses power. The tragedy of over-apologizing is how it convinces others to see you the same way you see yourself, small, guilty, undeserving of full respect. It diminishes your confidence, undermines your authority, and silently teaches people to overlook your needs. Worse still, it keeps you trapped in the role of the guilty one, reinforcing the belief that you must constantly seek permission to exist. Over time, "I'm sorry" stops being an expression of empathy and becomes an involuntary confession that you are never enough. Believing you are unworthy of love is one of the most devastating psychological wounds because it convinces you that no matter what you do, you will never be enough to deserve care, affection, or belonging. At its core, this belief whispers that love is something reserved for others, that your flaws are too deep, your mistakes too heavy, and your very existence too inadequate to be cherished. It shapes how you see yourself and poisons every relationship you enter, making you suspicious of kindness, dismissive of compliments, and fearful of intimacy. Even when love is offered freely, you push it away, certain that it is either a lie or a temporary illusion that will eventually collapse. This belief is often born from rejection, neglect, or abandonment in formative years. When caregivers or significant people in your life fail to affirm your worth, the child within you learns that love must be earned or begged for, and sometimes that it never comes at all. As an adult, these scars manifest as self-sabotage, choosing partners who mistreat you, staying in toxic relationships because you think it's the best you'll ever have, or isolating yourself to avoid the inevitable heartbreak you've already decided you deserve. What makes this belief so corrosive is how it blinds you to reality. You interpret others' affection as pity, their loyalty as obligation, their interest as temporary. You chase approval endlessly, only to reject it when it arrives. Over time, this conviction becomes a prison, one where you mistake suffering for fate. Believing you are unworthy of love doesn't just rob you of relationships, it robs you of hope, teaching you to abandon yourself long before anyone else ever could. Avoiding conflict at all costs. Avoiding conflict at all costs may seem like a way to preserve peace, but in reality, it creates a slow and suffocating erosion of your voice, your boundaries, and your authenticity. At its core, it is the fear that speaking up, disagreeing, or expressing dissatisfaction will destroy relationships, trigger rejection, or make you unlovable. So you swallow your words, bury your frustrations, and smile through the discomfort, convincing yourself that silence is safer than honesty. On the surface, you may look agreeable, even easygoing, but inside, every unspoken truth festers like a wound that never heals. This pattern often begins in environments where conflict was explosive, punished, or never resolved. You may have learned that speaking your mind led to chaos, so you adapted by staying quiet. As an adult, that adaptation turns into paralysis. You hesitate to express needs in relationships, you avoid setting boundaries at work, and you let resentment pile up because you are terrified of being seen as difficult. Yet, the more you avoid conflict, the more you lose control of your life. People begin to take advantage of your silence. You wake up in situations that feel suffocating because you never dared to resist. What makes this red flag so devastating is how it teaches you to betray yourself daily. The conflict you avoid with others transforms into an internal war, frustration battling fear, resentment clashing with silence. Every time you choose avoidance, you reinforce the belief that your feelings are less important than keeping others comfortable. But conflict avoided does not disappear. It grows in the shadows until it bursts, often in destructive ways that leave you feeling even more broken and unheard. Suppressing emotions. Suppressing emotions is like locking away parts of yourself in a cage, believing that by hiding your feelings, you'll protect yourself or keep others comfortable. At its core, it is the habit of swallowing anger, bearing sadness, disguising fear, and forcing a smile even when your world is falling apart. On the surface, it feels like control, like you're holding everything together. But underneath, those emotions do not disappear. They ferment, grow heavier, and eventually turn into bitterness, anxiety, or even physical illness. This pattern often forms in childhood, when expressing feelings brought punishment, rejection, or shame. You learned that emotions were dangerous, that vulnerability made you weak, that tears made you a burden. So you adapted by becoming silent, by tucking pain deep inside, by convincing yourself that if you don't acknowledge it, it can't hurt you. But suppression is not healing. It is slow destruction. Every unspoken word becomes a stone in your chest. Every unshed tear becomes a weight you carry into tomorrow. What makes suppressing emotions so destructive is the way it rewires your entire identity. You become disconnected from yourself, unable to name what you feel or ask for what you need. Relationships suffer because no one can truly connect with someone who is emotionally hidden, and the people who hurt you never see the consequences of their actions because you never speak them aloud. The tragedy is that emotions demand expression. When denied, they find other ways to escape, through anger that bursts uncontrollably, through numbness that makes life feel empty, through self-destruction that you can't explain. Suppressing emotions doesn't protect you. It breaks you quietly, from the inside out, until you forget what it feels like to live honestly in your own skin. Overthinking every decision. Overthinking every decision is a silent mental prison that convinces you that certainty must be achieved before you act. Yet the more you search for it, the further it slips away. At its core, it is the endless cycle of analyzing, questioning, and second-guessing until even the simplest choices feel unbearable. What should be a small step, what to wear, what to say, which path to take, becomes a battlefield in your mind, where every option is dissected, every outcome exaggerated, and every possibility twisted into a threat. Instead of moving forward, you stand frozen, consumed by the fear of making the wrong choice. This pattern often grows from environments where mistakes were punished or perfection was demanded, teaching you that one wrong move could ruin everything. Over time, your mind learns to replay scenarios over and over, obsessing over the what-ifs and catastrophizing outcomes that rarely happen. Even after you finally decide, relief doesn't come. Instead, you replay your choice, question it, and torment yourself with the possibility that you should have done differently. The cruelty of overthinking lies in how it steals time, energy, and peace. While your body is still, your mind is running a marathon. exhausting you with questions that have no clear answers. Life becomes something you plan endlessly but rarely experience because you are always caught in preparation, never in presence. Worse yet, overthinking convinces you that safety comes from control, but in reality, it only creates paralysis. You end up trapped in your own head, watching opportunities pass by, not because you couldn't act, but because you never gave yourself permission to. Perfectionism. Perfectionism is a relentless tyrant disguised as ambition, one that convinces you your worth lies only in flawlessness. At its core, it is the obsessive pursuit of an impossible standard, where nothing you do ever feels good enough, no matter how much effort, time, or energy you pour into it. Every accomplishment is followed not by satisfaction, but by the nagging voice that whispers, "You could have done better." Instead of celebrating progress, you fixate on the smallest flaws, rewriting, reworking, and rethinking until exhaustion consumes you. This pattern often forms in environments where love and approval were tied to achievement, where mistakes were punished harshly, or where vulnerability was seen as weakness. You learn to equate success with survival, to believe that perfection is the only shield strong enough to protect you from rejection or failure. As an adult, perfectionism doesn't just demand excellence, it demands self-erasure. You push your limits until burnout feels normal, and even then, you still feel like a fraud. What makes perfectionism so destructive is how it distorts your relationship with yourself. It turns mistakes into catastrophes, setbacks into proof of inadequacy, and rest into laziness. It keeps you trapped in an endless cycle where the bar always moves higher, ensuring that peace, joy, and contentment are forever out of reach. Relationships suffer too, because perfectionists often project their impossible standards onto others, breeding resentment and disconnection. And yet, beneath it all lies fear, the fear that if you are anything less than perfect, you will be unlovable, invisible, or forgotten. Perfectionism doesn't push you toward greatness. It chains you to an illusion, draining the life out of every victory you've ever earned. Negative self-talk. Negative self-talk is one of the most insidious psychological traps because it turns your own mind into an enemy that attacks you from within. At its core, it is the relentless stream of criticism, doubt, and shame that whispers, or sometimes screams, that you are not good enough, smart enough, attractive enough, or worthy enough. Unlike external criticism, which can be escaped, negative self-talk lives inside you, coloring every experience and twisting even victories into proof of your inadequacy. You make a mistake, and the voice tells you it's because you're stupid. You succeed, and the voice insists it was luck, nothing more. It becomes a constant echo chamber of cruelty that convinces you to believe the worst about yourself. This toxic pattern often takes root in early experiences where criticism outweighed encouragement, where mistakes were magnified but achievements minimized. Over time, that external judgment transforms into an internal tyrant that never rests. What makes negative self-talk so devastating is not just the words themselves, but the way they shape your reality. When you tell yourself you are worthless often enough, you stop taking chances, you stop pursuing dreams, and you begin to live as if failure is inevitable. The danger is that the brain believes repetition. It doesn't distinguish between truth and lies. Each time you insult yourself, you carve deeper grooves of self-doubt into your psyche. Eventually, you no longer need anyone else to tear you down. You do it for them. And the cruel irony is that while you would never speak to someone you love with such venom, you tolerate it from yourself every single day until your own voice becomes the most destructive weapon you face. Seeking validation. Constantly seeking validation constantly is a psychological trap that keeps you chained to the opinions of others, making your self-worth dependent on their approval. At its core, it is the relentless hunger to be seen, praised, and reassured, because without external affirmation, you feel invisible, unworthy, or incomplete. Every compliment becomes a temporary high, every silence feels like rejection, and every criticism pierces deeper than it should. You begin to measure your value not by who you are, but by how others respond to you. This cycle often begins in environments where love and attention were conditional, where you had to earn acceptance through achievement, obedience, or perfection. Over time, your brain wires itself to crave approval the way it craves survival. You post online waiting for likes, you replay conversations searching for signs of disapproval, and you bend yourself into versions that others will find pleasing. What makes this so destructive is the emptiness that follows. No amount of validation ever feels like enough, because the approval comes from outside, while the void is within. The constant search for validation robs you of authenticity. You stop acting from your own truth and instead perform what you think will win applause. Relationships become fragile because you are never fully yourself, always waiting, always adjusting, always chasing reassurance. And when approval doesn't come, the silence feels like abandonment, reinforcing the lie that you are unworthy. The tragedy is that in chasing validation, you hand strangers the power to define you. Every nod, every word, every look becomes a verdict on your existence. You become addicted to external approval while starving for the one thing you avoid giving yourself: unconditional acceptance. Fear of rejection. Fear of rejection is one of the most paralyzing psychological traps because it convinces you that every interaction is a test of your worth. At its core, it is the haunting belief that if people see the real you, they will turn away, leaving you exposed and unwanted. This fear wraps itself around your every move. You hesitate to speak your truth, to pursue your dreams, to express your feelings, because the thought of hearing no feels unbearable, as though it confirms your deepest suspicion that you are not enough. This fear often takes root in childhood, when love, approval, or attention was inconsistent or conditional. The absence of acceptance plants the belief that belonging is fragile and must be earned. As an adult, this wound shows up in relationships, friendships, and careers. You avoid taking risks because failure feels like humiliation. You silence your needs because voicing them feels like an invitation for abandonment. Even when opportunities appear, you hesitate, not because you lack ability, but because the sting of potential rejection feels like it could shatter you completely. What makes the fear of rejection so devastating is how it turns you against yourself. To avoid rejection, you shrink, conform, and hide, only to reject yourself before anyone else ever could. In chasing safety, you sacrifice authenticity, trading your voice for approval that never truly satisfies. The cruel irony is that rejection is an inevitable part of life, yet the fear of it makes you live as though every moment is a trial. And in doing so, you miss out on connection, growth, and love, not because others turned you away, but because you never dared to step forward. Difficulty trusting others. Difficulty trusting others is a wound that keeps you trapped behind invisible walls where every smile feels suspicious, every promise feels temporary, and every bond feels like a trap waiting to close on you. At its core, it is the inability to fully believe in another person's intentions, no matter how kind, consistent, or loyal they may be. You scan conversations for hidden motives, overanalyze gestures for signs of betrayal, and guard your heart so tightly that intimacy becomes a distant dream. It is not that you don't crave closeness, you crave it desperately, but the fear of being deceived or hurt again looms larger than the hope of being loved. This distrust is often born from betrayal, neglect, or abandonment. When someone you depended on broke your trust, whether a parent, a partner, or a friend, the shock rewired your brain to associate vulnerability with danger. You learned that letting someone in means giving them the power to destroy you, so you build fortresses out of suspicion and armor yourself with distance. Yet this armor becomes its own prison. What makes difficulty trusting others so destructive is how it sabotages the very connections you long for. You push people away before they can hurt you, misinterpret care as manipulation, and test the patience of those who truly want to be there. Relationships suffer because no matter how much proof someone gives you, it never feels like enough. And in the end, you're left with the bitter paradox. Your walls may keep out betrayal, but they also keep out love, leaving you safe from harm, yet starved of the very connection your soul is aching for. Impostor syndrome. Impostor syndrome is a deeply unsettling psychological wound that convinces you that no matter how much you achieve, you are a fraud waiting to be exposed. At its core, it is the constant belief that your success is not truly yours, that it was luck, timing, or other people's mistakes that put you where you are, and sooner or later, everyone will realize you don't belong. Each accomplishment feels less like proof of your ability and more like borrowed time, a fragile mask hiding the truth of your supposed inadequacy. This silent struggle often begins in high-pressure environments where perfection was expected, praise was rare, or comparison was constant. Over time, the voice of doubt becomes louder than the evidence of success. You could hold degrees, awards, or recognition, yet still feel undeserving, still terrified that one mistake will unravel everything. The cruel irony is that the higher you climb, the stronger the fear grows, because with each achievement comes greater pressure to prove you aren't a fraud. What makes imposter syndrome so damaging is the way it robs you of joy. Instead of celebrating victories, you discount them. Instead of embracing opportunities, you hesitate, convinced you aren't ready. Instead of feeling proud, you feel like a liar. This creates a cycle of anxiety and burnout, where you work harder and harder to cover up a deficiency that never existed. The tragedy is that imposter syndrome blinds you to your own brilliance. You live in constant fear of being unmasked, not realizing that the mask you fear is actually your true reflection, distorted by a lie you've carried for far too long. Comparing yourself to others. Comparing yourself to others is one of the most soul-crushing habits because it blinds you to your own worth while magnifying what you lack. At its core, it is the constant measuring of your life, achievements, looks, or happiness against someone else's highlight reel, and always finding yourself falling short. You scroll through social media and see curated perfection, and suddenly your own victories feel small, your progress insignificant, your life inadequate. The more you compare, the more you convince yourself that everyone else is ahead while you are being left behind. This pattern often grows from environments where worth was measured by competition. Siblings compared, grades ranked, accomplishments weighed. Instead of developing a strong internal compass, you learn to look outward, to gauge your value by how you stacked up against others. As an adult, that voice never stops. You see someone younger achieve what you've dreamed of, someone prettier get more attention, someone richer live the life you crave, and you spiral into shame. The devastation lies in how comparison erases perspective. It blinds you to the sacrifices others made, the struggles they hide, the pain they never show. You only see the surface and condemn yourself for not matching it. Over time, comparison breeds envy, resentment, and despair, poisoning relationships and suffocating gratitude. The tragedy is that comparison convinces you that your story is not enough. You stop celebrating your milestones, dismiss your progress, and punish yourself for not being someone else. And in that endless race, you forget the truth. The only person you were ever meant to compete with is the version of you from yesterday. Difficulty forgiving yourself. Difficulty forgiving yourself is a wound that festers quietly, poisoning your sense of worth and chaining you to the past. At its core, it is the inability to release the guilt, shame, or regret over mistakes you've made, things you've said, or opportunities you've missed. No matter how much time passes, the memory resurfaces, and with it comes the same crushing weight, reminding you of what you did wrong, convincing you that you are permanently stained by your failures. You replay scenarios over and over, rewriting the past in your head, wishing you had chosen differently, but the outcome never changes. What lingers is the self-punishment, the relentless inner critic that whispers, "You don't deserve peace." This struggle often begins in environments where mistakes were met with judgment rather than compassion, where errors felt like proof of your inadequacy rather than opportunities to grow. Over time, you internalize the belief that being imperfect makes you unworthy of love, success, or even happiness. As an adult, this turns into a cycle where you sabotage joy because you feel undeserving, or reject kindness because you can't let go of who you once were. The cruelty of being unable to forgive yourself is that it keeps you imprisoned in a story that has already ended. You carry the weight of past versions of yourself, dragging them into the present, punishing yourself long after the moment is gone. And while the world may have moved on, you remain stuck, shackled to your own judgment. It is not the mistake that breaks you, it is the refusal to release it, the endless belief that one wrong step defines your entire worth. Holding grudges. Holding grudges is a slow poison that seeps into your soul, chaining you to the very pain you wish to escape. At its core, it is the refusal to let go of anger, betrayal, or injustice, replaying the wound over and over as if keeping it alive will somehow protect you from ever being hurt again. But instead of protection, grudges become shackles, binding you to the past and keeping you in constant emotional warfare with ghosts who may have long forgotten you. Every time you revisit the memory, the anger resurfaces, the bitterness intensifies, and the wound deepens until it feels like part of your identity. This tendency often begins when forgiveness feels impossible, when the wrong done to you feels too great to release. The mind clings to the grudge like armor, convincing you that letting go means letting the offender win. Yet, in reality, it is you who continues to lose. Grudges do not punish those who hurt you. They punish you, draining your energy, distorting your worldview, and leaving little room for peace. They whisper that trust is foolish, that vulnerability is dangerous, and that the world is filled only with betrayal. What makes holding grudges so destructive is how it rewires your perception of life. You begin to see new relationships through the lens of old wounds, projecting past betrayals onto people who had nothing to do with them. It consumes joy, replacing it with suspicion and resentment. In truth, holding a grudge does not keep you strong. It keeps you stuck, trapped in an endless cycle where your heart never heals because it is too busy clutching the pain that broke it. Rumination on past mistakes. Rumination on past mistakes is a psychological trap that chains you to moments that cannot be undone, forcing you to relive them over and over until they consume your present. At its core, it is the compulsive replaying of failures, regrets, and wrong choices in your mind, as though rehearsing the pain could somehow change the outcome. Instead of learning from the past and moving forward, you become stuck inside it, dissecting every word you said, every action you took, every chance you missed. What makes this cycle so tormenting is that no matter how many times you replay the memory, the ending never changes, but the pain intensifies. This destructive pattern often emerges from perfectionism, shame, or environments where mistakes were punished harshly. When you internalize the belief that errors define your worth, your mind latches onto them like proof of your inadequacy. Even small missteps balloon into unbearable evidence that you are flawed beyond repair. The rumination becomes endless, keeping you awake at night, hijacking your thoughts during the day, draining you of energy and peace. The cruel reality of rumination is that it tricks you into thinking you are solving a problem, when in truth, you are only deepening the wound. By rehashing mistakes endlessly, you train your brain to associate your identity with failure. You stop living in the present because your mind is shackled to a past you cannot fix. The punishment becomes self-inflicted, and the prison is built from your own thoughts. Over time, rumination doesn't just replay your mistakes, it convinces you that you are the mistake, and that is the lie that quietly destroys you from within. Fear of failure. Fear of failure is one of the most paralyzing psychological prisons because it convinces you that trying is more dangerous than not moving at all. At its core, it is the dread that every mistake will expose you, every setback will humiliate you, and every risk will confirm your deepest belief that you are not enough. This fear doesn't just whisper, it roars, keeping you frozen in hesitation, choosing safety over growth, comfort over courage. You begin to live small, avoiding opportunities, relationships, and dreams, not because you don't want them, but because the possibility of failing feels unbearable. This fear often takes root in childhood when mistakes were met with harsh criticism, ridicule, or withdrawal of love. You learn early that failure equals rejection, so you grow into an adult who avoids risk, who clings to perfection, who would rather not try than try and fall short. The tragedy is that the fear becomes self-fulfilling. You don't fail because you're incapable. You fail because you never allow yourself to start. What makes the fear of failure so devastating is that it poisons how you see yourself. Every unrealized dream feels like proof of inadequacy. Every chance avoided becomes another confirmation that you're not strong enough. Over time, this fear doesn't just keep you from failing, it keeps you from living. You settle for less, silence your ambitions, and watch others chase what you secretly long for. And in the quiet moments, you are haunted not by the failures you endured, but by the countless chances you never took, all stolen by the belief that you were destined to lose before you even began. Avoiding responsibility. Avoiding responsibility is a psychological red flag that slowly strips away your power while making you believe you are protecting yourself. At its core, it is the instinct to deflect blame, deny accountability, or hide from the weight of consequences because facing them feels unbearable. You convince yourself that if you ignore the problem, it might disappear, or if you shift the blame, you'll stay safe from judgment. Yet, the very act of running leaves you trapped in cycles of stagnation, regret, and guilt. Instead of freedom, avoidance becomes a cage where your life is dictated by fear of being exposed as incapable or unworthy. This pattern often takes root in childhood, where mistakes were punished harshly, where responsibility was tied to shame rather than growth. Over time, you learn that ownership equals danger, so you protect yourself through denial, excuses, and evasion. As an adult, this avoidance seeps into work, relationships, and self-growth. You miss opportunities because stepping up feels risky. You damage trust because others can't rely on you. And deep down, you carry the silent knowledge that you are betraying yourself by refusing to face what is yours to face. The tragedy of avoiding responsibility is that it convinces you to surrender your control. By refusing to own your actions, you also give up your ability to change them. You remain stuck, replaying the same mistakes, watching your potential wither while convincing yourself it isn't your fault. But the cruelest part is how it corrodes your self-respect. You begin to see yourself as unreliable, as weak, as someone who can't be trusted even by your own standards. And that quiet disappointment lingers longer than any consequence ever could. Refusing to accept compliments. Refusing to accept compliments may seem harmless on the surface, but it reveals a deep fracture in how you see yourself. At its core, it is the automatic rejection of kindness, the inability to believe that others genuinely see something good in you. When someone praises your work, your appearance, or your character, you brush it off, downplay it, or twist it into a joke. To you, compliments feel like lies, exaggerations, or pity because your inner voice screams the opposite. You are not talented enough, not attractive enough, not worthy enough. Every kind word collides with that inner critic, and instead of letting it in, you deflect it, as if protection is more important than recognition. This pattern often begins in environments where validation was rare, conditional, or given with strings attached. Maybe you were raised in a household where achievements were ignored, or perhaps your successes were minimized, mocked, or compared to others. Over time, praise feels uncomfortable, even dangerous, because you never learned to trust it. As an adult, the result is heartbreaking. No matter how much others admire you, you never truly feel it. Compliments bounce off you like stones hitting armor, leaving you empty despite being surrounded by affirmation. What makes this so destructive is how it erases joy and connection. Compliments are not just words, they are gifts of recognition, attempts at closeness, reminders that others see value in you that you cannot see in yourself. Refusing them not only robs you of confidence, but also distances you from the people who genuinely want to uplift you. Over time, this habit reinforces the cruel belief that you are unworthy of love, ensuring that even when light shines on you, you step back into the shadows. Low self-esteem. Low self-esteem is one of the most crippling psychological red flags because it convinces you that you are fundamentally less than everyone else, that your presence is insignificant, and that your worth is conditional on proving yourself in ways you will never quite achieve. At its core, it is the deep-rooted belief that you are not good enough, not attractive enough, not smart enough, and not deserving of love, respect, or success. This belief seeps into every corner of your life, quietly dictating how you speak, how you walk into a room, how you handle opportunities, and even how you allow others to treat you. The origins of low self-esteem often lie in childhood environments where love was inconsistent, where criticism was louder than encouragement, or where comparison was constant and cruel. Over time, those voices of dismissal and judgment become internalized until they feel like your own truth. You begin to doubt every compliment, sabotage every chance to grow, and settle for far less than you deserve because deep down, you don't believe you're worthy of more. Relationships become unbalanced. You tolerate neglect, disrespect, or even abuse because part of you thinks that's all you can get. What makes low self-esteem so destructive is the way it silently rewrites your reality. It blinds you to your strengths, distorts your reflection in the mirror, and convinces you that every success is undeserved. Even when the world sees your light, you only see your shadows. The tragedy is not that you lack worth, it's that you stop seeing it, and once you stop seeing it, you stop living as if it exists. Low self-esteem doesn't just limit your potential, it convinces you that you never had any to begin with. Externalizing blame. Externalizing blame is one of the most deceptive psychological traps because it convinces you that the responsibility for your pain, failures, and unhappiness always lies in someone else's hands. At its core, it is the refusal to face your own role in the struggles you endure. Every setback is someone else's fault. Every disappointment is caused by another person's actions, and every mistake is explained away by circumstances beyond your control. In the moment, it feels safe. It shields you from guilt, shame, and the sting of accountability. But over time, it robs you of power, leaving you a prisoner to forces you claim you cannot change. This mindset often develops in environments where accountability was punished rather than taught, or where shame was too heavy to bear. Instead of learning that mistakes can be stepping stones, you learn to deflect, to protect yourself by pointing outward. As an adult, this reflex becomes automatic. If a relationship crumbles, it's entirely their fault. If work opportunities collapse, it's always the system. If life feels stagnant, it's because of what others did to you. What makes externalizing blame so destructive is the illusion it creates. It convinces you that you are a victim of life, not an active participant in shaping it. The more you avoid responsibility, the more powerless you feel, because change cannot happen where ownership does not exist. And slowly, resentment builds, resentment toward people, toward circumstances, toward the world, while your own agency withers. The tragedy is that by refusing to face the mirror, you forfeit your chance to grow. You cannot heal what you do not claim. You cannot rise from pain you keep pushing onto others. And so, externalizing blame becomes the quiet thief of accountability, leaving you stuck in cycles that only you have the power to break. Taking everything personally. Taking everything personally is a psychological trap that turns the world into a constant battlefield against your sense of worth. At its core, it is the belief that every comment, every look, every silence is somehow about you. A delayed text feels like rejection. A coworker's bad mood feels like your fault. A friend's distractedness feels like abandonment. You become hyper-attuned to every nuance, twisting neutral events into evidence that you are disliked, unwanted, or unworthy. What should be a passing moment instead becomes a dagger you replay endlessly in your mind. This pattern often stems from growing up in environments where love was unstable or criticism was frequent, training you to scan for threats and assume blame to protect yourself. Over time, you learn to carry guilt even when you've done nothing wrong, to expect rejection even when none is present, and to make other people's emotions your responsibility. As an adult, this turns every interaction into a test of your value. You overanalyze conversations, dissect tone, and convince yourself that others secretly think less of you. The cruelty of taking everything personally is how it eats away at your peace. You become imprisoned by assumptions, living in a world where you are constantly under scrutiny, constantly failing, constantly not enough. This mindset doesn't just exhaust you, it sabotages relationships. People pull away, not because they reject you, but because the weight of your self-blame makes connection heavy. And the bitter irony is that while you take everything as proof that you're unworthy, the only real rejection is the one you inflict on yourself by refusing to believe you could ever simply be okay as you are. Catastrophizing is a mental trap that turns every bump in the road into a landslide and every shadow into a storm. At its core, it is the habit of magnifying problems until they feel insurmountable, imagining the worst-case scenario as if it were inevitable. A missed call means tragedy. A mistake at work signals the end of your career. A small disagreement feels like the death of a relationship. Your mind spins ordinary challenges into disasters, leaving you paralyzed by fear of an outcome that hasn't even happened. This thought pattern often stems from growing up in unpredictable or unsafe environments, where danger felt constant and preparing for the worst became a survival mechanism. Your nervous system learned that safety meant anticipating disaster, even when none was present. As an adult, that instinct doesn't fade, it mutates. Instead of protecting you, it enslaves you, forcing you to live in a constant state of hypervigilance, always waiting for the world to collapse. What makes catastrophizing so damaging is how it steals the present. Instead of responding calmly to problems, you spiral into panic, draining your energy on scenarios that may never occur. It robs you of sleep, clarity, and trust, making every day feel like a battlefield. Relationships suffer because your fears overwhelm logic, pushing loved ones away as they struggle to soothe what cannot be soothed. Over time, catastrophizing convinces you that life is a minefield, that peace is dangerous, and that happiness is fragile. The tragedy is not just in fearing disasters, it's in living as though they've already arrived, and in doing so, never allowing yourself to feel safe. Black and white thinking. Black and white thinking is a psychological snare that traps you in extremes, convincing you that life exists only in absolutes, success or failure, love or rejection, good or evil, worthy or worthless. At its core, It strips away the shades of gray that make reality balanced, forcing you to see yourself, others, and the world in rigid, unforgiving categories. This distortion feels safe because it offers certainty, but in truth, it robs you of nuance and leaves you constantly swinging between elation and despair. One moment, you feel invincible. The next, a single mistake convinces you that you are irredeemable. This mindset often forms in environments where perfection was demanded, mistakes were magnified, and love or acceptance felt conditional. When raised to believe that there is no room for error, the brain learns to divide everything into extremes. Either you are perfect or you are nothing. As an adult, this way of thinking bleeds into relationships, work, and self-image. You either idolize someone or see them as the enemy. You either consider your life on track or completely ruined. There is no middle ground, no room for humanity, no forgiveness for imperfection. What makes black and white thinking so destructive is that it creates a cycle of constant disappointment. Reality is nuanced, messy, and imperfect, yet your mind refuses to accept that. You punish yourself for every misstep, sabotage relationships the moment cracks appear, and abandon dreams because they don't unfold flawlessly. Over time, this rigid lens doesn't just distort how you see the world, it erases your ability to experience it fully. You become a prisoner of absolutes, blind to the truth that real life is lived in the gray spaces you refuse to see. Overattachment to outcomes. Overattachment to outcomes is a psychological trap that chains your sense of worth and happiness to whether life unfolds exactly as you imagined. At its core, it is the relentless obsession with results, the belief that unless things turn out perfectly, everything is meaningless. You set goals, expectations, or dreams, and instead of enjoying the journey, you fixate on the finish line, believing that only when you arrive will you finally feel complete. But the cruel irony is that even when you achieve what you wanted, the satisfaction is fleeting, quickly replaced by the next unattainable target. This pattern often takes root in childhood environments where love and praise were conditional on achievement. You learned early that success was survival, and anything less was failure. As an adult, that belief intensifies. You tie your identity to winning, your joy to outcomes, and your worth to whether the world validates your effort. When things don't go your way, even slightly, it feels like devastation, as though the universe is confirming your deepest fear, that you are not enough. What makes overattachment to outcomes so destructive is how it steals the present moment. You stop living here and now, always chasing a future that never feels secure. Relationships, careers, even personal dreams become transactional, where every effort must produce a perfect result or it feels wasted. Over time, this obsession corrodes joy, leaving you anxious, restless, and perpetually unsatisfied. The tragedy is that by clinging so tightly to outcomes, you suffocate possibility. You miss the lessons in failure, the growth in uncertainty, and the beauty in imperfection. Overattachment convinces you that life is only meaningful when you win, while robbing you of the very moments that make life worth living. Inability to say no. The inability to say no is a dangerous fracture in your boundaries that convinces you that pleasing others is safer than protecting yourself. At its core, it is the fear that rejecting someone's request will lead to disappointment, conflict, or abandonment. So you agree, even when it drains you, even when it breaks you, even when every part of you is screaming against it. You take on more than you can handle, sacrifice your own needs, and swallow your exhaustion, all to keep others happy, while secretly resenting yourself for it. This struggle often grows from childhoods where love was conditional and compliance was rewarded. You may have learned early that saying no brought punishment, guilt, or rejection, and so yes became a survival strategy. As an adult, this turns into a relentless pattern of overcommitment. You become the one everyone depends on, the one who never refuses, the one who carries the weight of everyone else's needs while neglecting your own. On the outside, people may praise your generosity, but inside, you feel hollow, drained, and invisible. The cruelty of being unable to say no is that it convinces you to abandon yourself. Every time you agree when you don't want to, you send a message to your own soul that your peace matters less than others' comfort. Over time, you lose touch with who you are because your identity becomes wrapped around service and compliance. You become resentful yet trapped because the more you give, the more people expect. And the saddest truth is that while you fear losing love by saying no, the real loss is the love you never show yourself. Suppressing needs for others. Suppressing needs for others is one of the quietest yet most destructive psychological patterns because it teaches you that your own desires, feelings, and boundaries are unworthy of expression. At its core, it is the compulsion to bury what you truly want in order to maintain peace, avoid rejection, or secure love. You smile when you want to cry. You agree when your heart screams no, and you sacrifice your own well-being just to make others comfortable. Over time, this self-erasure becomes second nature until you forget what your own voice even sounds like. This habit is often born from childhoods where expressing needs was punished, mocked, or ignored. Maybe you learned early that love came only when you were easy and undemanding, or that conflict brought chaos, so you silenced yourself to survive. As an adult, this survival tactic mutates into self-betrayal. You become the caretaker, the peacemaker, the one who always puts others first, but deep inside, resentment festers. Your suppressed needs don't disappear, they rot in silence, creating bitterness and exhaustion. What makes suppressing needs so devastating is that it convinces you love must be earned through sacrifice, that your worth lies only in what you give up, not in who you are. Relationships become unbalanced, with you giving endlessly but never feeling truly seen or nourished in return. And while you may appear strong on the surface, the truth is you are starving for reciprocity, for authenticity, for the freedom to exist without apologizing. In silencing your needs, you do not preserve love, you destroy it, because love cannot thrive where one person disappears to keep the other comfortable. Guilt for prioritizing yourself. Guilt for prioritizing yourself is a hidden form of self-betrayal that convinces you that taking care of your own needs is selfish, indulgent, or wrong. At its core, it is the deep discomfort that rises any time you put yourself first, as though choosing rest, boundaries, or personal growth means you are neglecting or failing others. Every no you say feels like a crime. Every moment you choose your well-being over someone else's demands feels like evidence that you are unkind or unworthy of love. Instead of relief, self-care becomes drenched in shame. This guilt often grows from environments where your value was measured by how much you gave, how much you sacrificed, or how much you endured without complaint. You learned that love was earned by being useful, that approval came from selflessness, and that your own desires were secondary or even irrelevant. As an adult, those lessons become shackles. You overextend yourself, burn out, and yet still feel like you are not doing enough. When you finally dare to rest or say, "I can't," the guilt crashes in like a wave, drowning any sense of peace. What makes this pattern so destructive is that it convinces you to view self-preservation as betrayal. You neglect your health, suppress your dreams, and stay in draining situations because you fear the label of selfishness. Over time, resentment builds, not just toward others, but toward yourself, for abandoning your own needs in pursuit of approval that never lasts. The tragedy is that guilt for prioritizing yourself blinds you to a simple truth. You cannot pour into others if you are running on empty, yet this belief keeps you endlessly bleeding for everyone but yourself. Fear of vulnerability. Fear of vulnerability is one of the most heartbreaking psychological barriers because it convinces you that hiding your true self is safer than being seen. At its core, it is the dread of opening up, of exposing your wounds, desires, or weaknesses, because you believe that if people knew the real you, they would reject, ridicule, or abandon you. So you build walls, smiles that hide pain, sarcasm that masks sincerity, strength that conceals fragility. On the outside, you may appear composed, but inside you ache for connection while fearing it at the same time. This fear often grows from early betrayals, harsh criticism, or experiences where showing emotion led to hurt. You learn that vulnerability equals danger, and that the only way to survive is to armor yourself. As an adult, this armor becomes second nature. You avoid deep conversations, push people away when they get too close, and keep relationships shallow enough to feel safe. But the price of protection is isolation, because intimacy cannot exist without vulnerability. What makes the fear of vulnerability so destructive is how it starves you of the very thing you long for: love, closeness, and understanding. By refusing to open up, you guarantee loneliness even in crowded rooms. You replay the lie that strength is never showing weakness, while inside you feel unseen and unheard. The tragedy is that in running from vulnerability, you run from connection itself. The very walls you build to protect your heart become the prison that keeps you alone. And while hiding may spare you from rejection, it also robs you of the chance to be fully loved for who you truly are. Need for control. The need for control is a psychological trap that masquerades as safety, but leaves you imprisoned by fear. At its core, it is the desperate urge to micromanage people, outcomes, and environments, because uncertainty feels unbearable. You convince yourself that if you can plan enough, predict enough, and manage every detail, nothing bad can happen. Yet beneath that perfectionism lies terror, the terror of vulnerability, chaos, and being at the mercy of forces beyond your grasp. Instead of feeling secure, you live in constant vigilance, bracing for disaster if even the smallest detail slips through your fingers. This compulsion often grows from early experiences where life felt unpredictable, where love, safety, or stability could be taken away without warning. You learned that control was survival, that letting go meant being hurt. As an adult, this manifests in relationships where you struggle to trust, in work where you cannot delegate, and in daily life where small disruptions trigger outsized anxiety. You may try to control others' emotions, conversations, or choices, not out of malice, but out of desperation to feel stable in a world that has always felt unsafe. The cruelty of the need for control is how it suffocates you and those around you. You carry the weight of every responsibility, never truly resting, always scanning for what could go wrong. Others feel your grip and may pull away, resenting the constant pressure. And the bitter truth is that control is an illusion. You can never master every outcome, never bend life perfectly to your will. Instead of freedom, this obsession leaves you trapped in a cycle of tension, fear, and exhaustion, never able to breathe, because letting go feels like death. Difficulty asking for help. Difficulty asking for help is a silent struggle that traps you in cycles of exhaustion and loneliness, convincing you that leaning on others is weakness, failure, or a burden. At its core, it is the belief that you must carry everything on your own shoulders, no matter how heavy the load. Even when you are drowning, you smile and say you're fine. Even when your world is crumbling, you whisper, "I'll figure it out." And while the facade of strength may impress others, inside, you are slowly breaking under the weight of responsibilities you were never meant to bear alone. This difficulty often stems from early experiences where vulnerability was met with rejection, criticism, or shame. Maybe you were taught that asking for help made you incompetent, or perhaps you learned that the only person you could rely on was yourself. Over time, this hardened into a survival strategy: independence at all costs. As an adult, however, this armor turns into isolation. You hesitate to reach out, terrified of being judged, pitied, or worse, abandoned for showing weakness. What makes this so destructive is how it robs you of connection. Humans are wired for interdependence, for sharing burdens and receiving care. But when you refuse to ask for help, you deny yourself the healing of support and the intimacy of being understood. The world begins to feel colder, harsher, and lonelier, not because people won't be there for you, but because you never give them the chance. Difficulty asking for help doesn't just exhaust you, it isolates you, trapping you in a prison built from pride, fear, and unspoken pain. Feeling like a burden. Feeling like a burden is one of the most heartbreaking psychological traps because it convinces you that your very existence weighs too heavily on others, that your needs are inconveniences, and that your struggles are too much to be carried. At its core, it is the belief that asking for help, showing pain, or simply being yourself will drive people away because you are too much. This belief makes every favor feel like guilt, every request feel like begging, and every act of kindness from others feel undeserved. You begin to shrink yourself, holding back words, hiding emotions, and swallowing your pain because you fear that revealing your true weight will push others away. This wound often grows in environments where love was conditional, where vulnerability was dismissed, or where you were made to feel like your needs were excessive or annoying. Over time, that message hardens into a core belief: I am too heavy to love fully. As an adult, it shows up in silence during moments you desperately need comfort, in apologies for simply existing, in overcompensating with constant giving because you're terrified of taking. The cruel paradox is that while you believe you're sparing others, you're really starving yourself of connection, robbing loved ones of the chance to show up for you. What makes this red flag so devastating is how it isolates you. You retreat inward, convinced you must carry everything alone, while outwardly pretending to be fine. The isolation deepens the pain, and the pain deepens the belief. Over time, feeling like a burden doesn't just stop you from reaching for help. It convinces you that you don't deserve it at all, leaving you silently drowning while those who care never even realize you're slipping under. Dwelling on regrets. Dwelling on regrets is one of the most tormenting psychological traps because it forces you to live in a past you cannot change while stealing the peace of your present. At its core, it is the endless replay of mistakes, missed opportunities, and wrong choices, with each memory sharpened into a weapon against yourself. You wake up thinking about what you should have done differently, and you fall asleep haunted by the moments you can't undo. Every regret becomes a chain tethering you to yesterday, making it impossible to step fully into today. This cycle often begins when you carry shame from failures that were never forgiven by yourself or by others. Maybe it was a broken relationship, a lost chance, or a path you were too afraid to take. Instead of learning and moving forward, you hold on to it like proof that you are doomed to repeat it. The brain becomes addicted to replaying the pain, as though punishing yourself will rewrite the ending. But regret doesn't heal, it corrodes. It strips you of hope and convinces you that your future is permanently poisoned by your past. What makes dwelling on regrets so destructive is the illusion of control it creates. You keep thinking that if you analyze it one more time, you'll find the answer, the fix, the redemption. But the more you dwell, the deeper you sink into self-blame and despair. Over time, regret becomes your identity. You stop seeing yourself as who you are now, and instead as the sum of every mistake you've made. The tragedy is that regret convinces you life ended at the moment of your mistake, when in truth, the only ending comes from refusing to move beyond it. Overcompensating with achievements. Overcompensating with achievements is a hidden wound disguised as ambition, but beneath the trophies, promotions, and applause lies a gnawing emptiness that success can never fill. At its core, it is the desperate attempt to prove your worth by constantly achieving more, because deep down, you believe that without accomplishments, you are nothing. Every milestone that should feel like victory instead becomes a fleeting relief, quickly replaced by the pressure to chase the next one. No matter how high you climb, the summit always feels out of reach, because the voice inside whispers that you still haven't done enough. This cycle often takes root in childhood, when love and validation were tied to performance, when grades, awards, or obedience determined your value. You learned early that being seen required being exceptional, and that failure, or even mediocrity, meant invisibility or rejection. As an adult, you carry that hunger into your career, relationships, and personal goals, stacking achievements like armor to protect yourself from the shame of not feeling good enough. But the cruel irony is that no amount of success can silence the wound that drives it. The tragedy of overcompensating with achievements is that it steals the joy from life itself. You rarely pause to celebrate because celebration feels undeserved. You sacrifice rest, relationships, and even your health, convinced that only your next accomplishment will finally make you worthy. Yet the more you achieve, the emptier you feel, because achievements cannot heal the belief that you are broken without them. Instead of freedom, you become enslaved to the endless chase, mistaking external success for internal peace and wondering why, despite everything, you still feel like you are not enough. Self-isolation. Self-isolation is one of the most deceptive psychological traps because it convinces you that retreating from the world is safety, when in reality, it is a slow form of self-destruction. At its core, it is the choice to withdraw from relationships, opportunities, and experiences, not because you don't crave connection, but because connection feels dangerous, exhausting, or undeserved. You shut the door, silence the phone, avoid invitations, and convince yourself you are better off alone. Yet, beneath that armor of solitude lies a deep hunger for someone to notice, to care, to remind you that you still belong. This habit often grows out of betrayal, trauma, or chronic rejection. When reaching out has led to pain, the mind begins to equate isolation with protection. You tell yourself it's easier this way, that loneliness is preferable to disappointment, but over time the silence becomes unbearable. Days blur together, your inner voice grows louder and crueler, and without the grounding presence of others, you begin to lose perspective on reality itself. What makes self-isolation so dangerous is how it feeds the very wounds it promises to heal. The longer you stay hidden, the more alienated you feel. The more alienated you feel, the harder it becomes to reach out. It is a vicious cycle where loneliness reinforces shame, and shame drives you deeper into loneliness. Eventually, the world outside begins to feel foreign, and you convince yourself no one would understand you anyway. Self-isolation doesn't just protect you from pain, it starves you of joy, intimacy, and the lifeline of human connection that every soul desperately needs. Distrust in genuine kindness. Distrust in genuine kindness is a psychological wound that turns warmth into suspicion and care into a hidden threat. At its core, it is the belief that no one gives without wanting something in return, that every act of generosity is a mask for manipulation, and that kindness is a trap designed to pull you in before the betrayal comes. Instead of feeling safe when someone shows you love, you brace yourself for the inevitable sting, dissecting every word, every gesture, searching for the hidden agenda. What should feel comforting instead triggers unease, as though the kindness itself is too good to be true. This deep mistrust often grows from betrayal, neglect, or manipulation in the past, times when people offered affection only to withdraw it, when love was weaponized, or when generosity was used to control you. Over time, the brain learns to equate kindness with danger, programming you to keep walls up even in safe relationships. As an adult, you find yourself doubting compliments, brushing off caring gestures, or sabotaging connections because accepting them feels impossible. Rather than receiving love, you question it, analyze it, and reject it, terrified of what might be hiding beneath the surface. What makes this so destructive is how it robs you of connection. You long for love but cannot trust it. You crave support but cannot accept it. You desire closeness but push it away. Distrust in genuine kindness convinces you that isolation is safer than vulnerability, that suspicion is better than hope. But in protecting yourself from betrayal, you unknowingly exile yourself from the very love and comfort your heart desperately aches to receive. Overanalyzing conversations. Overanalyzing conversations is a quiet form of self-torture that turns simple interactions into endless mental battlegrounds. At its core, it is the compulsion to replay words, tone, and gestures over and over, dissecting every detail as though hidden meanings are lurking beneath the surface. A pause becomes rejection, a joke feels like mockery, a glance shifts into judgment. Instead of taking conversations at face value, you spiral into an exhausting search for subtext, convinced you missed something, or worse, that you embarrassed yourself without realizing it. This pattern often stems from insecurity, low self-esteem, or past experiences where missteps in communication led to real rejection or humiliation. The brain learns to scan for danger in every interaction, as though analyzing harder will protect you from future pain. But what it really does is steal your peace. Even long after the conversation has ended, you are trapped in it, replaying every word, rewriting what you should have said, punishing yourself for imaginary mistakes. What makes overanalyzing conversations so destructive is the way it distorts reality. You begin to assume the worst about how others see you, even when no evidence exists. Neutral remarks feel loaded, silence feels hostile, and your own self-doubt twists harmless exchanges into proof that you are unlikable or unworthy. Relationships suffer because instead of being present, you are stuck in your own head, constantly decoding meanings that were never there. The tragedy is that while you obsess over what others might think, you lose sight of the truth that most people move on within moments, while you remain imprisoned by echoes of words that no one else even remembers. Assuming worst-case scenarios. Assuming worst-case scenarios is a psychological reflex that tricks you into believing constant fear equals protection, when in reality, it chains you to suffering that hasn't even happened. At its core, it is the tendency to imagine the darkest possible outcome in every situation, expecting betrayal in love, disaster in opportunity, and failure in every attempt. Your mind becomes a battlefield of what-ifs, where even moments of peace feel suspicious, as though disaster is just around the corner. Instead of living in the present, you live in rehearsed catastrophes, bracing yourself for pain that may never come. This mindset often grows out of childhood environments where safety felt fragile, where unpredictability left you feeling powerless. Your brain learns to scan for danger as a way of surviving, but as an adult, that same hypervigilance backfires. You replay conversations, imagining how they will fall apart. You hesitate on risks, convinced the outcome will crush you. Even joy feels temporary, overshadowed by the dread of losing it. The cruelty of assuming worst-case scenarios is how it robs you of possibility. You avoid opportunities that could change your life, not because they are doomed, but because your fear convinces you they are. Relationships suffer because you interpret distance as rejection, silence as abandonment, and mistakes as endings. You sabotage yourself by treating fears as facts until you begin to live in a world that reflects your anxieties instead of reality. And the bitter truth is this: the pain you imagine often hurts more than the event itself, leaving you scarred by disasters that never even arrived. Resentment toward others' success. Resentment toward others' success is a corrosive flame that burns quietly within, consuming your joy and poisoning your relationships while disguising itself as bitterness or indifference. At its core, it is the inability to celebrate someone else's achievements because their light feels like a spotlight on your own perceived failures. When others rise, you don't feel inspired. You feel diminished, as if their gain proves your inadequacy. Every promotion, every milestone, every celebration becomes a mirror reflecting what you believe you lack, and the envy festers until admiration turns into quiet hostility. This resentment often grows in hearts that have been starved of validation, where self-worth was tied to achievement, comparison, or scarcity. Perhaps you were raised to believe love was conditional on being the best, or maybe repeated disappointments carved the belief that success was for them, never for you. In adulthood, that belief transforms into a toxic lens. Instead of seeing others' victories as proof of possibility, you see them as evidence that you are falling behind. What makes resentment so destructive is how it isolates you from both others and yourself. It keeps you trapped in a cycle of comparison, where joy feels impossible unless it outshines someone else's. It erodes trust because you cannot fully support or connect with people you secretly begrudge. Most tragically, it blinds you to your own progress, robbing you of gratitude and turning every step forward into a hollow victory. Resentment toward others' success does not protect you from inadequacy. It cements it, making you a prisoner to envy while the world moves forward without you. Jealousy. Jealousy is a corrosive psychological force that eats away at your peace, warps your perception, and poisons your relationships. At its core, it is the gnawing fear that someone else's success, beauty, or happiness somehow diminishes your own. It convinces you that love is scarce, that worth is a competition, and that if someone else shines, it means there is less light left for you. Instead of celebrating others, jealousy twists their achievements into a mirror reflecting your supposed inadequacy. It turns admiration into resentment and connection into comparison, leaving you perpetually unsatisfied with what you have. This wound often comes from environments where love, attention, or validation felt limited, where you were forced to compete for approval, or where comparison was constant and cruel. Over time, you internalize the belief that happiness is a zero-sum game, that someone else's gain is automatically your loss. As an adult, this shows up in relationships where you suspect betrayal even when there is none, in friendships where envy silently simmers, and in your own life where you sabotage joy because you are too focused on what others have. What makes jealousy so destructive is not just the way it distorts reality, but the way it corrodes your soul from the inside. You stop seeing your blessings because you're obsessed with someone else's. You push people away with suspicion, insecurity, or resentment, even when they've done nothing wrong. And perhaps the cruelest truth is this: jealousy doesn't take away the other person's happiness. It only steals yours, leaving you trapped in an endless cycle of longing, bitterness, and self-inflicted suffering. Codependency. Codependency is one of the most suffocating psychological traps because it convinces you that your identity, happiness, and very survival depend on keeping someone else stable, happy, or whole. At its core, it is the compulsive need to fix, rescue, or sacrifice yourself for another person, even at the expense of your own well-being. You become so entangled in their moods and choices that your emotions rise and fall with theirs. Their chaos becomes your chaos, their silence your panic, their approval your lifeline. You stop asking, "What do I need?" and instead live by the unspoken rule, "I am only okay if they are okay." This pattern often begins in childhood, where you may have had to take care of unstable, neglectful, or emotionally unavailable caregivers. You learned early that love meant caretaking, that safety meant controlling others' emotions, and that your needs didn't matter as long as you could keep the peace. As an adult, this wiring repeats in relationships. You give endlessly, ignore your own boundaries, and confuse self-sacrifice with devotion. What makes codependency so destructive is the illusion of love it creates. You believe you are being loyal, supportive, or selfless, but in reality, you are erasing yourself piece by piece. The more you pour into others, the more empty you become. Yet the cycle continues because you fear abandonment if you stop. Over time, you lose your sense of self entirely, becoming an extension of someone else's needs, unable to function without their presence. The tragedy is that codependency feels like love, but robs both people of freedom. One becomes dependent on being saved, the other on doing the saving, and in the end, neither truly thrives. It is not love. It is entrapment disguised as devotion. Tolerating toxic behavior. Tolerating toxic behavior is a dangerous self-betrayal disguised as patience, loyalty, or love. At its core, it is the silent agreement to accept mistreatment, manipulation, or disrespect because you are afraid of losing someone, afraid of conflict, or afraid of being alone. You convince yourself it's not that bad, that they'll change, that you can handle it. But with every excuse, every second chance, every swallowed protest, you teach yourself to normalize pain and call it love. The longer you stay, the more the poison seeps into your identity until you forget what respect, peace, and safety are supposed to feel like. This tolerance often takes root in environments where love was conditional, where chaos was disguised as care, or where you were taught to sacrifice your own needs to keep others satisfied. As an adult, you replay the same script, downplaying red flags, ignoring your instincts, and convincing yourself that enduring someone's toxicity is proof of strength. But what it really proves is how deeply you've been taught to abandon yourself. The cruelty of tolerating toxic behavior is how it erodes you slowly. It doesn't break you all at once. It chips away piece by piece until you doubt your worth, silence your truth, and settle for pain disguised as connection. And while you endure to keep the relationship, the reality is that you are the one disappearing. Every time you accept less than you deserve, you confirm the lie that this is all you're worthy of. And in that quiet surrender, the real damage isn't what they do to you, it's what you allow them to teach you about yourself. Overextending yourself. Overextending yourself is the quiet destruction of your body, mind, and spirit, disguised as productivity and generosity. At its core, it is the relentless compulsion to give more than you have, more time, more energy, more patience, until there is nothing left for yourself. You say yes when you want to say no, take on tasks that are not yours to carry, and push through exhaustion because the fear of disappointing others feels heavier than the weight of your own burnout. To the outside world, you look capable, dependable, admirable, but inside you are unraveling, trading your well-being for the fleeting approval of others. This pattern often comes from deeply ingrained beliefs that your worth is measured by how much you can do, how much you can give, or how much you can endure. Maybe you grew up in an environment where rest was laziness, or where love was tied to service and sacrifice. Over time, you learn to ignore your body's signals, silencing the cries for rest with caffeine, overcommitment, and the illusion of strength. What makes overextending yourself so dangerous is that it convinces you depletion is noble. You tell yourself you can handle it, but the cracks appear: irritability, fatigue, resentment, and a gnawing emptiness that no achievement can fill. Relationships suffer too, because when you give past your limits, your love turns to obligation and your kindness to bitterness. Overextending doesn't make you stronger, it makes you fragile, running on fumes until one small demand breaks you. It is the silent sacrifice of your health and happiness for a world that will keep asking for more, even as you disappear. Chasing unavailable people. Chasing unavailable people is one of the most heartbreaking psychological patterns because it convinces you to pour your love, time, and energy into those who cannot or will not give it back. At its core, It is the pursuit of connection with people who are emotionally distant, inconsistent, or outright rejecting, while you remain hooked on the hope that if you try hard enough, you'll finally be chosen. Every crumb of attention feels like a feast. Every fleeting moment of closeness fuels the illusion that love is within reach, and every withdrawal only deepens your desperation to win them over. Instead of walking away, you chase harder, confusing suffering for devotion. This cycle often grows from childhood wounds where affection was inconsistent or conditional, where love had to be earned through effort, patience, or sacrifice. You learn to equate unavailability with value, convincing yourself that love worth having must be fought for. As an adult, you're drawn to partners who are detached, dismissive, or emotionally absent because their distance feels hauntingly familiar. The cruel irony is that the very thing you're running from, feeling unwanted, becomes the very thing you keep running toward. What makes this red flag so devastating is the way it traps you in a cycle of self-abandonment. You ignore your needs, silence your pain, and lower your worth just to be tolerated by someone who never intends to give you what you crave. And while you chase them, the people who could truly love you go unnoticed. Chasing unavailable people convinces you that love is suffering, but the deeper truth is that it's not love you're chasing. It's the hope of finally healing a wound that was never your fault to begin with. Ignoring intuition. Ignoring intuition is one of the most dangerous psychological red flags because it silences the very voice meant to protect you. At its core, it is the act of dismissing the gut feelings, subtle warnings, and inner knowing that arise when something isn't right. You feel the unease in your stomach, the tension in your chest, the quiet whisper urging you to pay attention, but you push it aside, convincing yourself you're overreacting, being dramatic, or imagining things. And yet, every time you ignore that inner signal, you betray yourself, leaving the door wide open for pain you could have avoided. This habit often forms when you grow up in environments where your perceptions were denied or ridiculed. Maybe you were told you were too sensitive or made to believe your feelings weren't valid. Over time, you learn to distrust your own instincts and replace them with the opinions of others. As an adult, that disconnection becomes costly. You stay in relationships that drain you, trust people who show you red flags, or make choices that go against your deeper truth, all because you no longer recognize the voice within. What makes ignoring intuition so destructive is that your body often knows the truth long before your mind admits it. Every time you silence it, you teach yourself that your inner wisdom cannot be trusted, and the consequences can be devastating. Betrayal you sensed but denied, opportunities you passed on despite the pull, danger you felt but ignored. The tragedy is that intuition is not irrational. It is your deepest form of intelligence, built on patterns, instincts, and truths your conscious mind cannot yet see. To ignore it is to cut yourself off from the compass designed to guide and protect you. Self-sabotage. Self-sabotage is one of the most devastating psychological red flags because it convinces you to destroy the very things you want most, often without realizing it. At its core, it is the unconscious habit of undermining your own progress, procrastinating when opportunity arrives, ending relationships when love feels too close, or doubting yourself just as success is within reach. You become your own obstacle, creating excuses, distractions, and chaos that keep you from stepping into the life you deserve. It feels safer to fail on your own terms than to risk the vulnerability of truly trying and possibly being rejected. This destructive pattern often stems from deep-seated beliefs planted early, messages that you weren't enough, that you didn't deserve happiness, or that love and success were always temporary. Over time, your mind internalizes those lies and begins to enforce them, making you sabotage anything that contradicts them. When good things appear, you push them away. When progress begins, you stall. When love enters, you test it until it breaks, all because the pain of confirming your old wounds feels familiar, while the hope of something better feels terrifying. The cruelty of self-sabotage is how it keeps you trapped in cycles of disappointment. You tell yourself stories that justify your failures, bad timing, wrong people, bad luck, when deep down, you know you were the one who pulled the plug. And each time you do, the voice of unworthiness grows louder, convincing you that you proved yourself right. You were never capable, never lovable, never enough. Self-sabotage doesn't just block your path forward, it convinces you to build your own prison and call it protection. Anger outbursts. Anger outbursts are emotional explosions that erupt like storms, often leaving behind destruction, far greater than the trigger that set them off. At their core, they are not simply expressions of frustration, but eruptions of suppressed pain, fear, and resentment that have built up until the pressure can no longer be contained. In these moments, words become weapons, tone becomes fire, and the people around you often become collateral damage. The release feels powerful, even justified for a fleeting second, but what follows is guilt, shame, and fractured relationships that are hard to repair. These outbursts often stem from unhealed wounds, environments where emotions were silenced until they burst, or childhoods where anger was the only emotion that felt safe to show. Instead of addressing vulnerability, sadness, or fear, the body channels everything into rage because rage feels protective, impenetrable, and commanding. But the truth is, these eruptions are less about strength and more about fragility. They reveal an inability to regulate emotions, a desperate attempt to be heard, and a fear that calm expression will go unnoticed. What makes anger outbursts so destructive is not just the damage they cause externally, but the toll they take internally. Every explosion reinforces the cycle of shame, convincing you that you are out of control, unworthy of trust, incapable of peace. Loved ones begin to walk on eggshells, intimacy is replaced with fear, and the very connections you long for are driven further away. In the end, anger outbursts don't bring resolution. They leave you isolated, exhausted, and trapped in a pattern where pain speaks louder than love ever could. Passive aggressiveness. Passive aggressiveness is a subtle yet deeply destructive psychological pattern that hides hostility behind politeness, masks resentment with sarcasm, and replaces honesty with indirect jabs. At its core, it is the inability or refusal to express anger, frustration, or disagreement openly, so instead, it leaks out in sideways comments, silent treatments, and behaviors designed to sting without ever being named. On the surface, it looks like calmness, but underneath it is boiling rage that never finds a healthy outlet. Each sarcastic remark, each calculated silence, each disguised insult is a weapon that cuts relationships slowly, leaving wounds that are difficult to heal because the pain is never addressed directly. This behavior often grows from environments where conflict was unsafe, where expressing needs was punished, or where open confrontation led to rejection or chaos. Over time, you learn that the only way to release anger without risking abandonment is to do it indirectly. As an adult, this shows up as backhanded compliments, procrastination to sabotage expectations, or icy silence that speaks louder than words. The tragedy is that while passive aggressiveness feels safer than direct honesty, it erodes trust far more deeply. What makes passive aggressiveness so destructive is its ambiguity. The target feels the sting but can't confront it without being accused of overreacting. This gaslighting effect leaves relationships tense, confused, and full of unspoken resentment. Over time, passive aggressiveness doesn't just hurt others, it hurts you. You bury your real feelings so deeply that you forget how to voice them, and in the process, you sacrifice authentic connection for a facade of control. It is a quiet war that destroys intimacy, leaving both sides wounded, but never able to name the battle. Silent treatment. Silent treatment is one of the most insidious psychological weapons because it punishes not with words, but with their absence. At its core, it is the deliberate withdrawal of communication, affection, and acknowledgement as a way to control, manipulate, or hurt someone. Unlike healthy space or reflection, silent treatment is calculated. It starves the other person of connection until they break, apologize, or beg for reconciliation. It creates a suffocating void where every unanswered message feels like rejection, every avoided glance feels like abandonment, and every moment of silence deepens the wound. This behavior often stems from unresolved insecurity, fear of confrontation, or a desperate need for control. For the one using it, silence feels like power, an escape from vulnerability, and an effective way to shift blame. For the one receiving it, silence becomes torment. The human brain is wired to crave connection, and when that bond is deliberately severed, it triggers the same regions associated with physical pain. The victim begins to spiral, questioning their worth, replaying every detail, and often apologizing just to end the unbearable quiet. What makes silent treatment so destructive is that it doesn't resolve conflict. It deepens it. Issues are never addressed. Trust is shattered, and intimacy is replaced with fear. Over time, the victim becomes conditioned to silence, walking on eggshells to avoid triggering it again. The relationship transforms into a battlefield where communication is withheld like a weapon, leaving scars that no apology can erase. The tragedy of silent treatment is that it masquerades as distance, but is really emotional cruelty. It doesn't heal. It doesn't teach. It only breaks the very bond it pretends to protect. Avoidant attachment. Avoidant attachment is a psychological defense mechanism disguised as independence, but beneath it lies a deep fear of intimacy and vulnerability. At its core, it is the tendency to keep others at arm's length, to withdraw when relationships grow too close, and to equate closeness with danger. You crave connection, but when someone offers it, you feel suffocated, exposed, or threatened. Love begins to feel like a trap, and distance feels like safety. So you push people away, shut down emotionally, or bury yourself in work and distractions to avoid facing the terrifying possibility of being truly seen. This attachment style often develops in childhood environments where emotional needs were neglected, dismissed, or punished. When care was inconsistent or overwhelming, your young mind learned that self-reliance was safer than trust. As an adult, this wound shows up in relationships where you avoid vulnerability, struggle to express needs, or disappear the moment things get serious. You may convince yourself that you are better off alone, but beneath that mask of independence is a quiet loneliness, a longing for intimacy that you never feel safe enough to allow. The cruelty of avoidant attachment is how it sabotages the very thing you desire most. You ache for connection but push it away. You yearn to be understood but remain silent. You dream of love but retreat at the first sign of closeness. And while you tell yourself that walls protect you, the truth is they cage you, keeping out not just pain, but also joy, tenderness, and belonging. In protecting yourself from being hurt, you end up hurting yourself most by never letting anyone in. Anxious attachment. Anxious attachment is a psychological tether that keeps you chained to fear, insecurity, and a constant craving for reassurance. At its core, it is the belief that love is fragile and fleeting, that at any moment the person you care about might leave, betray, or withdraw their affection. This fear makes every unanswered text feel like rejection, every moment of distance feel like abandonment, and every argument feel like the beginning of the end. Instead of resting in the safety of love, you live in a state of hypervigilance, scanning for signs that the person you depend on is slipping away. This attachment style often grows from childhood experiences where love was inconsistent, where attention was unpredictable, or where affection came with conditions. A child learns quickly that closeness is not guaranteed, and so they cling, chase, and desperately seek validation to secure it. As an adult, this translates into relationships filled with neediness, overanalyzing, and emotional roller coasters. You may find yourself bending your boundaries, sacrificing your peace, or suppressing your true feelings just to keep the other person close, terrified that authenticity might drive them away. What makes anxious attachment so painful is how it sabotages the very love you crave. The more you cling, the more suffocated your partner feels. The more reassurance you seek, the less secure you feel when it fades. It creates a cycle where your fear of abandonment becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. You long for intimacy, but your desperation for it becomes overwhelming, turning love into a battlefield of constant tests, doubts, and pleas for closeness. Anxious attachment doesn't just fear loss, it rehearses it daily until love feels like walking on the edge of a cliff, always bracing for the fall. Believing happiness is external. Believing happiness is external is one of the most deceptive psychological traps because it convinces you that peace, fulfillment, and joy live outside of yourself, always in the next achievement, the next relationship, the next possession. At its core, it is the relentless chase for happiness, as if it were a prize to be earned rather than a state to be cultivated within. You tell yourself, I'll be happy when I make more money. I'll be happy when they love me. I'll be happy when I finally get there. But every time you reach the goal, the joy fades and the chase begins again. The finish line keeps moving and you never truly arrive. This mindset often grows from cultural conditioning and early experiences that taught you your worth was measured by external markers, grades, looks, approval, status. Over time, you begin to outsource your self-worth to achievements and possessions, believing that without them, you are nothing. As an adult, this leaves you endlessly running on a treadmill of desire, exhausted but unable to stop, because stopping would force you to face the terrifying silence within. What makes this belief so destructive is that it guarantees perpetual emptiness. Even when others admire your life, you feel hollow inside because your happiness is always somewhere else, just out of reach. Relationships suffer because you see others not as partners, but as providers of your missing joy. Your identity becomes tied to things you cannot control, leaving you powerless when they shift or disappear. Believing happiness is external blinds you to the truth that joy cannot be given or taken away, only discovered, and by ignoring this, you trap yourself in a cycle of longing that never ends. Relying on substances to cope. Relying on substances to cope is one of the most destructive psychological red flags because it convinces you that relief can only be found at the bottom of a bottle, in a pill, or through a hit. At its core, it is the attempt to numb what feels unbearable, to quiet the racing thoughts, dull the pain, silence the loneliness, or escape the emptiness inside. For a moment, it works. The weight lifts, the noise fades, the ache softens, but it is only temporary, and when the effect wears off, the pain not only returns, it returns heavier, chained to shame and dependency. This cycle often begins when emotions feel too overwhelming to face directly. Maybe trauma, heartbreak, or chronic stress left wounds too deep to process, and substances became the shortcut to survival. But what starts as just to take the edge off quickly becomes reliance, and reliance becomes addiction. The brain learns to associate relief with the substance, and soon you reach for it not just in crisis, but in habit, unable to imagine life without it. What makes this so devastating is the way it steals from you quietly. Relationships fracture as loved ones watch you slip further away. Dreams are abandoned because the substance becomes the priority. Your health deteriorates, your spirit weakens, and the very escape you sought becomes the prison that traps you. The tragedy of relying on substances to cope is that it promises freedom but delivers chains. It offers silence but deepens suffering. And while it numbs pain for a moment, it steals the very strength you need to heal it, leaving you dependent, hollow, and further from yourself with every use. Escapism through distractions. Escapism through distractions is a subtle form of self-destruction that feels harmless on the surface, but erodes your life from within. At its core, it is the habit of burying yourself in television, games, social media, substances, or endless busyness, not because you enjoy them, but because they numb the thoughts and feelings you can't bear to face. Instead of confronting pain, trauma, or dissatisfaction, you drown it in noise and stimulation, hoping that if you stay distracted long enough, the weight inside will disappear. But it never does. It only waits for the silence to return, heavier than before. This pattern often grows from unresolved wounds, from experiences where your feelings were ignored, or where vulnerability felt unsafe. Over time, you learn to avoid rather than to process, to run rather than to heal. As an adult, escapism becomes your refuge, but also your prison. Hours slip into days, days into years, as you live half present, half absent, physically alive but emotionally disconnected. The things that should bring joy turn into compulsions, temporary bandages over wounds that never close. The cruelty of escapism is how it robs you of both pain and joy. By numbing what hurts, you also numb what heals. You miss opportunities, neglect relationships, and delay growth because the distraction feels easier than the truth. Yet deep down, you know you are not running toward anything. You are only running away. And the harshest reality is that no amount of distraction can erase what you refuse to face. The pain you silence becomes the shadow that follows you, no matter how fast you run. Inability to handle criticism. The inability to handle criticism is a psychological wound that turns every piece of feedback, no matter how gentle, into a dagger aimed at your self-worth. At its core, it is the belief that being corrected, questioned, or challenged is not about your actions. It is about you being flawed, unworthy, or unlovable. A single suggestion feels like condemnation. A small critique feels like rejection, and what others see as growth opportunities, you interpret as proof of failure. Instead of hearing words, you hear attack. Instead of considering improvement, you prepare for defense or collapse into shame. This reaction is often rooted in environments where mistakes were punished harshly or where nothing you did was ever enough. Growing up under constant scrutiny wires your nervous system to equate criticism with danger, humiliation, or abandonment. As an adult, this pattern mutates into hypersensitivity, making it nearly impossible to separate your identity from your actions. A comment on your work feels like a comment on your soul. What makes this so destructive is how it blocks growth and damages relationships. You may avoid challenges altogether just to protect yourself from possible critique, staying small rather than risking exposure. Or you may lash out at those who offer feedback, pushing away people who genuinely want to help you improve. Over time, this fragility turns into isolation. Colleagues stop offering input, friends stop being honest, and loved ones feel silence. The inability to handle criticism doesn't protect you from pain. It amplifies it, locking you in a cycle where every word of feedback feels like a confirmation of your deepest fear, that you are not enough. Over-identifying with your trauma. Over-identifying with your trauma is a psychological trap that convinces you that the worst thing that happened to you is the only thing that defines you. At its core, it is the merging of your identity with your pain, where you stop seeing yourself as a whole person and instead view yourself only through the lens of what you've suffered, the abuse, the betrayal, the loss, the violation. These become not just chapters in your story, but the entire book, erasing all the other parts of who you are. Instead of saying, "This happened to me," you begin to say, "This is me." This attachment often forms because trauma reshapes the brain, leaving emotional imprints so powerful they distort how you see the world and yourself. When left unresolved, the trauma becomes the filter through which every interaction, relationship, and decision passes. You begin to expect pain, to search for danger, to sabotage joy, because somewhere deep down, you believe you are too broken to deserve it. The cruel irony is that trauma, which you never asked for, starts to feel like both your prison and your identity. What makes over-identifying with trauma so destructive is that it chains you to the very thing you want freedom from. You bond with your wounds so tightly that healing feels like losing yourself, and in clinging to them, you deny yourself growth. Relationships become heavy because you lead with your scars instead of your heart. Dreams wither because you convince yourself your pain defines your limits. Over time, the trauma isn't just something that happened. It becomes the mask you wear, and behind it, the real you struggles to breathe. Feeling powerless. Feeling powerless is one of the most paralyzing psychological states because it convinces you that no matter what you do, nothing will ever change. At its core, it is the crushing belief that your voice doesn't matter, your choices don't count, and your future is out of your hands. You wake each day with the sense that life is happening to you, not with you, like you are a spectator in your own story. The world feels too big, too heavy, too ruthless, and you feel too small to fight back. This mindset often forms from repeated experiences of helplessness, abuse, neglect, failures, or constant invalidation that teach you early that effort brings no reward and resistance brings no relief. Over time, the lesson becomes internalized. Why try if nothing changes? As an adult, you stop pushing, stop hoping, stop daring. You settle into survival mode, where merely existing feels like all you can manage. What makes feeling powerless so destructive is how it seeps into every part of life. You stop standing up for yourself in relationships, allowing others to walk over you because you believe you have no control. You stay in jobs or situations that drain you, convinced that escape isn't possible. You silence your dreams before they can breathe, because somewhere deep down, you believe you don't have the strength to make them real. The tragedy is that feeling powerless blinds you to the truth, that power is not always about controlling everything, but about reclaiming even the smallest choices. Yet when this belief takes root, you forget that even a whisper is still a voice, and even one step forward is still movement, no matter how heavy the chains feel. Hopelessness. Hopelessness is one of the most suffocating psychological red flags because it convinces you that nothing will ever change, that no matter what you do, the outcome will remain the same. At its core, it is the crushing belief that the future holds no light, that effort is pointless, and that even if you fight, you will lose. It is not just sadness, it is the absence of belief in possibility. You wake up feeling heavy, go through the motions without meaning, and see tomorrow as nothing more than a repeat of today's despair. This mindset often grows out of repeated disappointments, broken promises, or long-term suffering that wore down your resilience. When you try and fail again and again, the mind learns to protect itself by whispering, "Why bother?" Eventually, you stop chasing goals, stop seeking connection, and stop imagining a future because hope feels like a cruel trick that only leads to more pain. In this place, even good things feel temporary, like sand slipping through your fingers before you can hold them. The cruelty of hopelessness is how it steals your vision of what could be. It blinds you to opportunities, muffles your desires, and convinces you that joy is for other people, not for you. Relationships feel empty, dreams feel impossible, and even survival feels meaningless. You are alive, but not living, breathing, but hollow. And perhaps the deepest wound of hopelessness is not the absence of hope itself, but the way it convinces you that you never deserved it in the first place. That light was never meant to find you. Emotional numbness. Emotional numbness is a silent thief that doesn't rip your heart apart with pain. It robs you of feeling altogether. At its core, it is the experience of being alive yet detached, where joy, sadness, love, and even anger feel muted, distant, or entirely absent. You go through the motions of life, working, talking, smiling, but inside it feels hollow, as if a thick glass wall separates you from the world. Moments that should bring excitement feel flat, and losses that should bring tears leave you strangely untouched. It is not peace, it is emptiness, and it quietly convinces you that something essential within you has been switched off. This state often develops as a defense mechanism against overwhelming stress, grief, or trauma. When emotions once became too painful to bear, your mind protected you by shutting them down, creating a numbed existence where you feel safe from intensity but also disconnected from life itself. What once shielded you becomes a prison. You watch others laugh, cry, and connect, but you feel like a shadow drifting among the living, unable to participate fully in any of it. What makes emotional numbness so destructive is how it steals your humanity piece by piece. Relationships suffer because loved ones can't feel you present. You withdraw not because you don't care, but because you don't feel enough to show it. Over time, you begin to wonder if you are broken beyond repair, mistaking survival for failure. Emotional numbness does not spare you from pain. It spares you from everything, leaving you trapped in a life that feels more like existing than living. Living in denial. Living in denial is a quiet form of self-destruction that convinces you it is safer to close your eyes than to face the truth staring back at you. At its core, it is the refusal to acknowledge reality, whether it's the toxic relationship that's draining you, the addiction that's consuming you, the unhappiness that's breaking you, or the choices that are leading you deeper into pain. Denial dresses itself as protection, whispering that if you don't admit it, it isn't real. But beneath that illusion, your problems grow like shadows in the dark, stronger and more dangerous the longer you refuse to look. This coping mechanism often develops when the truth feels unbearable, when reality threatens to shatter the fragile sense of control you cling to. As a child, you may have learned to ignore chaos, abuse, or neglect because acknowledging it would have been too overwhelming. As an adult, denial resurfaces as avoidance. You tell yourself you're fine when you're breaking, that they love you when they're hurting you, that everything is under control when it's already falling apart. Each lie to yourself buys temporary comfort but costs long-term damage. What makes living in denial so devastating is the slow erosion of your life while you pretend it isn't happening. Opportunities slip away, relationships rot, and your own spirit withers because you are too afraid to face the pain that could set you free. The tragedy is that denial doesn't erase reality, it only delays it. And the longer you live behind the shield of denial, the harder the truth will crash down when it finally breaks through. Ignoring red flags in others. Ignoring red flags in others is one of the most dangerous psychological traps because it convinces you to overlook the very signs meant to protect you. At its core, it is the act of seeing troubling behavior, disrespect, manipulation, dishonesty, control, and dismissing it as temporary, excusable, or your fault. Deep down, you feel the unease. You notice the inconsistencies, the broken promises, the subtle digs, but instead of confronting them, you minimize them, telling yourself, it's not that bad, they'll change, I can handle it. Each time you silence that inner warning, you surrender another piece of your safety. This tendency often grows out of fear, fear of being alone, fear of conflict, fear that speaking up will drive people away. Sometimes it stems from childhood, where unhealthy behaviors were normalized, teaching you to accept chaos as love. As an adult, that conditioning pulls you into cycles where you tolerate what should never be tolerated, because walking away feels more terrifying than staying. What makes ignoring red flags so devastating is the way it builds slowly. The first excuse seems harmless, the second feels forgivable, but over time, you find yourself entangled in toxic relationships, wondering how you got so deep while knowing the signs were there from the start. And by the time you recognize the danger, the damage has already carved into your spirit. The tragedy is that by ignoring red flags in others, you betray yourself. You silence the intuition that whispers the truth. You trade temporary comfort for long-term pain, and in protecting them from accountability, you leave yourself unprotected, carrying wounds that could have been avoided if only you had listened when your soul first said something isn't right. Obsessive need for approval. The obsessive need for approval is a psychological hunger that can never be satisfied, no matter how much praise or recognition you receive. At its core, it is the belief that your value exists only in the eyes of others, that without their validation, you are invisible, unworthy, or incomplete. Every compliment gives you a fleeting high, but it fades quickly, leaving you desperate for the next one. Every silence feels like rejection. Every neutral expression feels like judgment, and every bit of criticism cuts deeper than it should, because your sense of self is built on fragile ground. This obsession often stems from childhood environments where love was conditional, where approval was rare, or where you were rewarded only when you performed, obeyed, or impressed. You grew up chasing acceptance as though it were oxygen, and as an adult, that chase never stops. In relationships, you mold yourself to what others want. At work, you overextend to avoid disapproval. In life, you silence your true desires because they might clash with what others expect. The cruelty of needing approval obsessively is that it turns you into a prisoner of perception. You abandon your own instincts, your own voice, your own truth, just to avoid the unbearable thought of disappointing someone. And even when you succeed in pleasing them, the relief doesn't last. You are already chasing the next nod, the next smile, the next reassurance. The most painful part is that while you search endlessly outside yourself for validation, the one approval you truly crave, the one that could set you free, is the one you've never given yourself. Overcommitting to avoid rejection. Overcommitting to avoid rejection is a dangerous cycle where you trade your time, energy, and peace for the fragile illusion of acceptance. At its core, it is the fear that saying no will make you unwanted, unloved, or abandoned, so you say yes to everything, every favor, every demand, every opportunity, until you are stretched so thin that you barely recognize yourself. You become the dependable one, the fixer, the constant giver, not because you always want to, but because the thought of disappointing someone terrifies you more than exhaustion ever could. This pattern often forms in childhoods where love was conditional on performance, obedience, or usefulness. You learned that to keep people close, you had to over-deliver, to constantly prove your worth through sacrifice. As an adult, this morphs into a compulsion to fill every request, fearing that rejection lurks behind any boundary you try to set. On the outside, you may appear generous, hardworking, even admirable, but inside, you are drained, resentful, and terrified of the moment your efforts are no longer enough. What makes overcommitting so destructive is that it erases your identity. You lose track of your own desires, bury your needs under obligations, and slowly become invisible behind the roles you play for others. Relationships become transactional. Your presence is tied to what you provide, not who you are. And the cruel irony is that, in trying to avoid rejection, you create it. People connect with a version of you that isn't real, leaving you lonelier than before. Overcommitting doesn't guarantee acceptance. It guarantees that you abandon yourself long before anyone else has the chance to. Fear of intimacy. Fear of intimacy is a psychological wound that convinces you that closeness is dangerous, that vulnerability is a trap, and that letting someone see the real you will only end in rejection, betrayal, or abandonment. At its core, it is not the fear of love itself, but the terror of what love demands. Exposure. To be truly intimate means to be seen, flaws and all. And for someone carrying this fear, that kind of exposure feels unbearable. So you build walls disguised as independence. You push people away with coldness or distance, and you sabotage connections the moment they begin to feel too real. This fear often grows from childhood experiences where trust was broken, where love was inconsistent, or where vulnerability was met with pain instead of safety. You learn that opening yourself up invites danger, so you adapt by staying hidden. As an adult, this pattern seeps into relationships. Perhaps you crave closeness desperately, but the moment someone gets near, panic sets in. You find faults in them to justify pulling back. You bury yourself in distractions, or you choose partners who are unavailable so that true intimacy never has the chance to develop. What makes fear of intimacy so destructive is its cruel paradox. You long for love, yet run from it. You crave connection, yet sabotage it. You desire to be understood, yet hide behind masks. Over time, loneliness becomes your companion, not because others have abandoned you, but because you've abandoned your own longing for closeness. Fear of intimacy convinces you that distance is safety, but the reality is that it leaves you starved of the very connection your heart aches for most. Staying in one-sided relationships. Staying in one-sided relationships is one of the most heartbreaking forms of self-betrayal because it convinces you to settle for scraps of affection while starving for the love you truly deserve. At its core, it is the pattern of giving endlessly, your time, energy, forgiveness, and loyalty, while receiving little to nothing in return. You make excuses for their neglect, minimize your own pain, and cling to fleeting moments of kindness as proof that things will get better. Deep down, you know the balance is broken, but the fear of being alone feels more unbearable than the slow erosion of your worth. This cycle often begins when you are taught that love must be earned, or when abandonment in the past has made you desperate to hold on to anyone who stays, no matter how poorly they treat you. You convince yourself that if you give enough, wait long enough, or change yourself enough, they will finally meet you halfway. But instead, the relationship drains you, your needs dismissed, your boundaries ignored, your heart taken for granted. What makes staying in one-sided relationships so destructive is how it teaches you to mistake survival for love. You silence your own pain in exchange for the illusion of connection, ignoring the loneliness that lingers even when you're together. Each day you stay, you reinforce the lie that you are not worthy of reciprocity, that asking for more is too much, that you should be grateful for even the crumbs. And over time, this belief doesn't just break your heart, it convinces you to abandon yourself for someone who never intended to truly hold you. Idealizing relationships. Idealizing relationships is a deeply destructive psychological pattern because it blinds you to reality and sets you up for inevitable heartbreak. At its core, it is the tendency to place another person on a pedestal, convincing yourself that they are perfect, flawless, or the answer to your emptiness. You project fantasies onto them, believing they will fix you, save you, or make your life whole. And in doing so, you stop seeing them as they are and start seeing them as who you need them to be. Every flaw gets dismissed, every red flag excused, every disappointment rationalized, because admitting the truth would shatter the dream you've built. This habit often grows from deep insecurity or unmet emotional needs, where love feels like salvation rather than partnership. Maybe you grew up longing for affection that was never fully given, so now when you feel a spark, you magnify it into a fire. Instead of pacing yourself, you dive in headfirst, attaching your self-worth to someone else's presence. Their attention feels like oxygen, and without it, you feel like you can't breathe. What makes idealizing relationships so dangerous is that it traps you in illusions. You ignore mistreatment because you've already decided they are the one. You overlook incompatibility because your fantasy feels more important than reality. And when the cracks inevitably show, you blame yourself, believing you weren't enough to keep the dream alive. The tragedy of idealizing relationships is that it robs you of authentic love. By chasing perfection, you miss the beauty of real, imperfect connection. And worse, you abandon yourself in the process, molding your identity to fit a fantasy that was never meant to last. Believing love must be earned. Believing love must be earned is one of the most damaging psychological red flags because it convinces you that affection, acceptance, and belonging are conditional rewards rather than your birthright. At its core, it is the belief that you must perform, achieve, sacrifice, or mold yourself into someone else's ideal in order to be worthy of love. You work tirelessly to prove your value, giving endlessly, pleasing relentlessly, striving for perfection, only to feel empty when love still feels just out of reach. Instead of resting in the comfort of being loved for who you are, you live in constant fear that if you stop trying, the love will vanish. This wound often grows from childhoods where love was inconsistent or conditional, where affection was given only when you excelled, behaved, or met expectations. You learned early that love was not something given freely, but something fragile that could be withdrawn the moment you faltered. As an adult, this belief follows you into relationships where you overextend, overgive, and oversacrifice, all while doubting whether you are ever truly enough. Even when someone does love you genuinely, it feels suspicious, undeserved, or temporary, because deep down, you don't believe you are lovable without constant effort. The cruelty of believing love must be earned is how it robs you of intimacy. You never feel safe, never feel at rest, never feel truly seen. You confuse exhaustion for devotion, self-erasure for loyalty, and fear for passion. And the saddest truth is that no matter how much you give, it will never feel like enough, because love was never meant to be earned, yet you spend your life chasing it like a debt you can never repay. Normalizing mistreatment. Normalizing mistreatment is a dangerous psychological trap that convinces you that pain, disrespect, and neglect are simply the price you must pay to be loved. At its core, it is the acceptance of toxic behavior as normal, where raised voices become just how relationships are, where manipulation feels like passion, and where emotional neglect is mistaken for independence. You tell yourself it isn't that bad, that everyone goes through this, that you're too sensitive, or that if you just hold on a little longer, things will change. Over time, mistreatment stops feeling like an intrusion and starts feeling like home. This mindset often grows from childhood environments where love was tangled with chaos, where abuse or neglect was part of daily life, or where you were taught that your needs didn't matter. As an adult, those early experiences become the blueprint for your relationships. You confuse toxicity with normalcy, mistaking familiarity for safety. When someone treats you with kindness and consistency, it almost feels foreign, even uncomfortable, because your brain has been wired to expect mistreatment as the baseline. What makes this red flag so destructive is that it erodes your sense of worth until you no longer question what you deserve. You tolerate cruelty, minimize abuse, and silence your pain because you've convinced yourself this is just what love looks like. The tragedy is that by normalizing mistreatment, you don't just endure harm, you reinforce it, allowing the cycle to continue. And each time you accept less than you deserve, you send yourself the message that your value is measured by how much suffering you can endure rather than how much love you are worthy of receiving. Minimizing your own needs. Minimizing your own needs is one of the most subtle yet destructive psychological patterns because it convinces you that what you feel, want, or require doesn't matter. At its core, it is the quiet dismissal of your own humanity. You downplay your exhaustion, silence your hunger for love, ignore your pain, and convince yourself that asking for anything makes you selfish or burdensome. You give endlessly, accommodate constantly, and smile while your spirit withers, because somewhere deep inside, you've been taught that everyone else's comfort matters more than your own survival. This pattern often forms in childhood when expressing needs was met with rejection, ridicule, or neglect. You learned that being too loud, too emotional, or too demanding would push love away, so you shrank yourself to stay safe. As an adult, this survival tactic becomes a prison. You let relationships drain you because you're afraid to ask for reciprocity. You take on more than you can handle at work because you're terrified of seeming incapable. You silence your voice in moments when it trembles to be heard. What makes minimizing your own needs so destructive is how invisible it makes you, even to yourself. Over time, you lose touch with what you truly want because you've trained yourself to believe it doesn't matter. Resentment grows in silence. Bitterness festers beneath your smile, and slowly you begin to disappear. The tragedy is that by minimizing your needs, you not only betray yourself, but also starve your relationships of authenticity. You teach others that you require nothing, when in truth, you are drowning. And the longer you deny those needs, the louder the emptiness grows, echoing a truth you can't escape. Neglecting yourself is its own form of abandonment, over-relying on others' opinions. Over-relying on others' opinions is a psychological trap that slowly erases your own voice until you no longer know who you are without someone else's approval. At its core, it is the inability to trust your own judgment, the constant need to seek advice, validation, or reassurance before making any move. Every decision becomes a poll, every choice a committee, every action dependent on how others might perceive it. You silence your instincts, not because they are wrong, but because you fear being wrong alone. This dependence often begins in environments where your thoughts or feelings were dismissed, criticized, or punished. When your own perspective was repeatedly invalidated, you learn to outsource your choices to others who seemed more certain. As an adult, this manifests in relationships, careers, and even the smallest daily decisions. You second-guess yourself endlessly, measuring your worth through the eyes of others and panicking at the thought of disapproval. And even when you follow their advice, you rarely feel secure because you no longer recognize your own inner compass. The cruelty of over-relying on others' opinions is how it convinces you to abandon your own. You become a reflection of what others want, a collage of borrowed voices, while your true self fades quietly in the background. Life becomes less about living authentically and more about avoiding mistakes, disappointing others, or standing out in the wrong way. But the bitter irony is that no matter how many opinions you gather, no one else can live your life for you. And when you silence your own, you lose the one voice that matters most, the one that could have led you home. Equating productivity with worth. Equating productivity with worth is a relentless psychological trap that convinces you that who you are matters less than what you produce. At its core, it is the belief that rest is laziness, that slowing down is failure, and that your value as a human being is measured in checklists, deadlines, and accomplishments. Every empty hour feels like wasted time. Every missed goal feels like personal failure, and even when you achieve something great, the satisfaction fades almost instantly, replaced by the next demand you impose on yourself. You don't allow yourself to simply be, you only allow yourself to do. This mindset often takes root in environments where love, praise, or recognition was tied to achievement. Maybe you were celebrated only when you performed, or perhaps you internalized the message that success equals survival. Over time, you begin to treat yourself like a machine, driving your body and mind past their limits in pursuit of external validation. The tragedy is that no matter how much you accomplish, it never feels like enough because the bar keeps moving higher. What makes equating productivity with worth so destructive is how it strips away your humanity. Relationships become strained because you view time spent resting, laughing, or simply existing as unproductive. Your health begins to erode under the weight of constant striving, and joy becomes something postponed indefinitely. Worst of all, you begin to believe that if you stop producing, you stop deserving love, respect, or even existence itself. This illusion doesn't inspire greatness. It enslaves you, leaving you burned out, disconnected, and forever chasing a finish line that doesn't exist. Burnout denial. Burnout denial is a psychological red flag that convinces you exhaustion is strength, that running on empty is noble, and that your collapsing body and mind are signs of weakness you must simply push through. At its core, it is the refusal to acknowledge that you are depleted, choosing instead to drown yourself in productivity, obligations, and endless shoulds. You tell yourself you're fine, that everyone feels this way, that resting would mean falling behind. Meanwhile, your body screams in fatigue, your mind clouds with fog, and your spirit quietly breaks under the weight you refuse to set down. This denial often stems from environments where worth was measured by output, where slowing down was equated with laziness, or where you learned early on that love and validation came only when you were achieving. As an adult, you internalize this as a relentless drive. You can't stop because stopping feels like failing. Even when the headaches, irritability, and emotional numbness set in, you dismiss them as temporary, telling yourself you just need more discipline, more caffeine, more grits. What makes burnout denial so dangerous is that it blinds you to the cliff you're running toward. You minimize the warning signs, ignoring the way your passion has turned to apathy, your focus to distraction, your joy to emptiness. You normalize exhaustion until you can no longer distinguish between living and simply surviving. The tragedy is that burnout doesn't ask for permission, it takes what it wants. And by the time denial cracks and reality sets in, the damage has often already been done, leaving you hollowed out from a battle you refuse to admit you were even fighting. Tolerating disrespect. Tolerating disrespect is one of the most damaging psychological red flags because it conditions you to accept treatment that chips away at your dignity, piece by piece. At its core, it is the act of swallowing insults, ignoring demeaning behavior, or brushing off mistreatment as if it were normal or deserved. You tell yourself it's not a big deal, that they didn't mean it, or that keeping the peace is more important than speaking up. But every time you excuse disrespect, you send a silent message to yourself and to them that your worth is negotiable. This pattern often develops when you grow up in environments where respect was not given freely, or where love was tangled with criticism, belittling, or neglect. You internalize the belief that being mistreated is part of love, part of life, part of what you must endure to belong. As an adult, this conditioning pulls you into relationships, friendships, and workplaces where you tolerate what should never be tolerated. And with each moment of silence, you begin to forget what it feels like to demand better. What makes tolerating disrespect so destructive is how it slowly erodes your self-esteem. The longer you allow it, the more you begin to believe the words, the tone, the actions are justified, that you somehow deserve less. You compromise your boundaries, bury your anger, and live in quiet resentment while others grow comfortable taking more than they should. The tragedy is that disrespect tolerated becomes disrespect normalized, and when you normalize it, you don't just lose the respect of others, you lose your own. Each act you endure without resistance carves away at your sense of worth until you're left questioning why you feel so small in a world where you were never meant to shrink. Victim mentality. Victim mentality is a psychological prison that convinces you that life is something happening to you, never something you have the power to shape. At its core, it is the belief that you are helpless, cursed, or destined to suffer, that no matter what you do, the world will always conspire against you. Every setback becomes proof of your powerlessness. Every disappointment evidence that you were right to expect the worst. You replay your pain like a script, clinging to it because it feels safer to blame circumstances or others than to face the terrifying truth that you might have the ability to change. This mindset often forms in environments where control was stripped away, where trauma, neglect, or instability made you feel powerless. Over time, helplessness becomes familiar, and you carry it into adulthood like armor. You resist accountability because it feels like blame. You avoid risk because failure would confirm the story you already tell yourself. Even when opportunities arise, you sabotage them because stepping into power would mean letting go of the identity that has defined you for so long. The cruelty of victim mentality is that it chains you to your own suffering. By believing you have no control, you guarantee that nothing changes. You reject solutions, dismiss encouragement, and turn away from possibilities because they threaten the identity you've built around your pain. And the darkest irony is this: the world does not need to hold you back when you are already holding yourself down. The cage is no longer locked from the outside. You keep the door closed, convinced that escape was never an option. Lack of accountability. Lack of accountability is a corrosive pattern that quietly destroys trust, growth, and self-respect because it convinces you that your mistakes are always someone else's fault. At its core, it is the refusal to own your actions, the instinct to shift blame, make excuses, or deny wrongdoing to protect your ego from discomfort. When problems arise, you point outward instead of inward, convincing yourself that circumstances, bad luck, or other people are always responsible. In the moment, it feels like self-preservation, but in reality, it keeps you stuck in a cycle where learning and healing never take root. This avoidance often develops in environments where mistakes were punished harshly, where admitting fault brought shame or rejection. Over time, taking responsibility begins to feel like admitting you are broken or unworthy, so you armor yourself with defensiveness. As an adult, this armor turns into denial. You dismiss feedback, rewrite history, or lash out when confronted, because accepting accountability feels like annihilation. What makes lack of accountability so destructive is how it corrodes every part of your life. Relationships become fragile because trust cannot survive when apologies are absent and promises mean nothing. Growth becomes impossible because you cannot change what you refuse to acknowledge. And internally, shame festers because deep down, you know you are running from yourself. Every excuse, every deflection, every denial becomes another brick in the wall separating you from authenticity and peace. Lack of accountability doesn't shield you from judgment. It ensures that the same wounds repeat, trapping you in a cycle of broken trust and wasted potential that only you can break, yet refuse to face. Chronic procrastination. Chronic procrastination is a silent psychological sabotage that convinces you there will always be more time, while quietly stealing your future one delayed decision at a time. At its core, it is not simple laziness, but a paralyzing cycle of avoidance, avoiding failure, avoiding judgment, avoiding the discomfort of effort. You tell yourself you'll start tomorrow, yet tomorrow always becomes another tomorrow. Deadlines creep closer, opportunities slip through your fingers, and with each delay, the weight of guilt grows heavier, feeding the very cycle that keeps you stuck. This destructive habit often grows from fear of not being good enough, fear of imperfection, fear of facing the pressure that comes with actually trying. Perfectionists are especially vulnerable because the idea of doing something wrong feels unbearable, so they avoid doing it at all. The cruel irony is that while procrastination offers short-term relief from stress, it creates long-term suffering. The relief of avoidance is fleeting, but the shame of inaction lingers and multiplies. What makes chronic procrastination so damaging is how it erodes your self-trust. Each promise you break to yourself chips away at your confidence. You begin to see yourself not as capable, but as unreliable, someone who always falls short. Dreams wither, not because you lacked talent or opportunity, but because you never started. Over time, procrastination doesn't just steal hours, it steals years, convincing you that your potential will wait for you. But it doesn't. And one day, you look back and realize the life you wanted wasn't taken from you. You handed it away, piece by piece, every time you whispered, "I'll do it later." Constantly second-guessing decisions. Constantly second-guessing decisions is a psychological weight that traps you in an endless cycle of doubt and regret. At its core, it is the inability to trust yourself, the compulsion to revisit every choice you make, big or small, as if replaying it enough times will reveal a perfect answer. You agonize over whether you said the right thing, chose the right path, or missed a better option. Instead of moving forward, you remain stuck in loops of what if, paralyzed by the fear of making a mistake. This pattern often develops from experiences where your judgment was constantly criticized or invalidated. Perhaps, growing up, every choice you made was questioned, every mistake punished harshly, or every success overshadowed. Over time, you learned that your instincts were unreliable, that you couldn't be trusted with your own life. As an adult, the habit clings to you. You ask for reassurance, seek endless opinions, and even after making a decision, you wrestle with the idea that you chose wrong. What makes this so destructive is how it drains your energy and erodes your confidence. Instead of standing firm, you wobble. Instead of learning from mistakes, you try to avoid them entirely. Yet in doing so, you avoid living. Relationships, careers, and opportunities suffer because hesitation makes you appear unsure, and opportunities vanish while you're still overthinking. The tragedy of second-guessing is that it convinces you certainty exists when it doesn't. Life is built on choices, risks, and imperfection, yet this constant doubt robs you of peace. You trade the possibility of growth for the illusion of safety, never realizing that in refusing to trust yourself, you betray the one voice that matters most, your own. Struggling with identity. Struggling with identity is a quiet war within yourself, a constant sense of disconnection where you don't fully know who you are, what you want, or where you belong. At its core, it is the feeling of being lost in your own skin, of wearing masks for different people, yet never feeling truly authentic in any of them. You shift your personality, your values, even your dreams to fit what others expect, but when the noise dies down, you're left with an unsettling emptiness. The question, "Who am I?" lingers like a shadow you can't escape, and the silence that follows is deafening. This struggle often grows from childhood environments where you were never allowed to explore your true self, where love or acceptance depended on performance, compliance, or fitting into a role you never chose. Over time, you bury parts of yourself, silencing your real voice just to survive. As an adult, this creates a cycle of confusion and restlessness. You chase identities through careers, relationships, and achievements, hoping one of them will finally make you feel whole, but none of them stick because they are built on external validation rather than inner truth. The cruelty of struggling with identity is how it convinces you that you are a stranger in your own life. You watch others live with clarity and confidence, while you feel fragmented, unsure, and invisible. Every choice feels borrowed, every version of yourself feels incomplete, and the most painful part is that you long to be seen and known, yet you cannot offer the world a self that you've never truly found. It is not just being lost, it is the haunting fear that you may never be found at all. Living for others' expectations. Living for others' expectations is a quiet kind of suffocation that convinces you the only way to be accepted is to abandon yourself. At its core, It is the habit of shaping your choices, your personality, and even your dreams to fit into molds that were never yours. You choose careers that please your family, friendships that look good from the outside, and lifestyles that earn approval, all while your true desires wither in silence. Every decision becomes a performance, every success feels hollow, and every failure feels catastrophic because it isn't just your own, it is the failure to meet the standards others set for you. This pattern often begins in childhood when love and validation were tied to compliance, achievement, or obedience. You learned early that being yourself was risky, so you buried your authenticity under layers of shoulds and musts. As an adult, that conditioning becomes a prison. You wake up every day chasing applause that never fills the void, terrified of disapproval and disconnected from the life you were meant to live. What makes living for others' expectations so devastating is how it erases your identity piece by piece. You may appear successful, admired, even envied, yet inside you feel empty, restless, and unseen. The applause is loud, but it never feels like it's for you, only for the mask you wear. Over time, the weight of pretending becomes unbearable because no amount of external approval can heal the pain of abandoning yourself. Living for others' expectations doesn't just cost you your happiness, it robs you of your freedom, leaving you trapped in a life that was never truly yours. Inability to accept change. Inability to accept change is a psychological trap that chains you to the past and blinds you to possibility. At its core, it is the desperate need for certainty, routine, and familiarity, even when those very things are suffocating you. Change becomes the enemy, a threat to stability, and instead of adapting, you cling tighter to what you know. You replay old habits, old relationships, and old versions of yourself, terrified that stepping into the unknown will only bring loss or failure. What should be growth feels like death, because every shift forces you to grieve the illusion of control you thought you had. This resistance often grows from fear, fear of abandonment, fear of failure, fear that the new will strip you of the little security you've managed to hold. Childhood environments marked by unpredictability can intensify this wound, teaching you to cling to whatever feels constant, even if it hurts. As an adult, this manifests as staying in toxic relationships because leaving feels too uncertain, remaining in unfulfilling jobs because change feels too risky, or sabotaging opportunities because they disrupt your comfort zone. What makes this red flag so destructive is that life itself is change. Seasons shift, people grow, circumstances evolve, and by resisting, you set yourself up for endless suffering. You trade possibility for stagnation, joy for familiarity, growth for fear. Over time, the inability to accept change doesn't just keep you stuck, it convinces you that you are powerless, that the future is something to fear rather than shape. And in clinging so tightly to what is slipping away, you lose the chance to embrace what could have been yours all along. Emotional reactivity. Emotional reactivity is one of the most destabilizing psychological red flags because it keeps you trapped in a state where every feeling dictates your actions. At its core, it is the inability to pause, reflect, and respond with clarity. Every frustration becomes an explosion. Every insult feels like a war. Every disappointment spirals into despair. You are pulled like a puppet by the intensity of your emotions, saying things you later regret, making choices in the heat of the moment, and burning bridges you never meant to destroy. This pattern often develops when emotions were never modeled as safe to express or regulate. Perhaps you grew up in chaos, where anger and fear filled the air, and you learned to mirror it. Or maybe you were never taught how to sit with discomfort. So, as an adult, every feeling feels urgent, unbearable, and in need of immediate release. Over time, this lack of regulation wires your brain to equate feeling with acting, never allowing space for thought or restraint. What makes emotional reactivity so destructive is the damage it causes to relationships and to yourself. Loved ones begin to walk on eggshells, fearing your outbursts. Opportunities slip away because people see volatility instead of reliability. And deep inside, you feel ashamed, replaying the words you can't take back and the moments you wish you could redo. The tragedy of emotional reactivity is that it convinces you that you are a prisoner of your feelings, when in truth, the power was always yours. But without awareness, emotions remain the driver, and you are left clinging to the wreckage of choices made in seconds that leave scars for years. Difficulty letting go. Difficulty letting go is a psychological anchor that drags you backward, keeping you chained to what has already ended. At its core, it is the inability to release past relationships, failures, betrayals, or regrets, even when holding on only deepens your suffering. You replay memories like broken records, cling to what-ifs, and keep wounds open by refusing to let them heal. The pain becomes familiar and, in a strange way, comforting, because if you let go, you fear losing the last thread of what once mattered. So you grip tighter, even as it cuts into you. This struggle often comes from deep emotional attachments or unresolved trauma. When love, security, or identity was tied to someone or something, the idea of losing it feels like losing yourself. As an adult, you may stay in toxic relationships, obsess over past mistakes, or carry resentment long after the other person has moved on. Letting go feels like surrender, like admitting defeat, or worse, accepting that the story will never unfold the way you wanted it to. The cruelty of being unable to let go is how it robs you of the present. You are alive, but not here, trapped between what was and what will never be. New opportunities feel out of reach because your hands are too full of ghosts. Relationships suffer because your heart is still entangled in the past. And the bitter truth is that holding on doesn't preserve what you lost. It only preserves your pain. The more you cling, the more you bleed, until the weight of yesterday crushes the possibility of tomorrow. Clinging to toxic familiarity. Clinging to toxic familiarity is one of the most dangerous traps of the human heart, because it convinces you that pain you recognize is safer than peace you don't yet know. At its core, it is the tendency to stay bound to people, places, and patterns that hurt you simply because they feel familiar. The chaos becomes comfort, the dysfunction becomes normal, and the wounds become so ingrained that you mistake them for love. You tell yourself, at least I know what to expect, even as the cycle of hurt grinds you down again and again. This attachment often begins in childhood, where unstable or harmful environments wired your nervous system to equate inconsistency with love. If affection was paired with neglect or safety with volatility, you learn to survive by adapting to pain. As an adult, those early imprints lead you back to what you already know: partners who mistreat you, friendships that drain you, jobs that devalue you. It doesn't feel good, but it feels familiar, and familiarity masquerades as safety. What makes clinging to toxic familiarity so devastating is how it traps you in loops of suffering. You begin to believe there is no alternative, that healthier love or calmer environments are illusions reserved for others. The unknown feels scarier than the abuse you've normalized, so you stay, silently breaking, quietly convincing yourself that this is just who you are meant to be with or where you are meant to remain. But each time you cling to toxicity, you abandon yourself a little more until you can no longer tell the difference between comfort and captivity. Believing suffering is noble. Believing suffering is noble is a psychological illusion that convinces you that pain is proof of worth, that struggle is a badge of honor, and that enduring misery somehow makes you more deserving of love or respect. At its core, it is the glorification of hardship, where rest feels like weakness, joy feels undeserved, and choosing ease feels shameful. You begin to equate suffering with value, telling yourself that the more you sacrifice, the more meaningful your life must be. Instead of seeking peace, you seek struggle, because somewhere deep inside, you've been taught that happiness is shallow, but suffering is holy. This belief often grows from cultural, religious, or familial narratives that praised endurance while dismissing joy. You may have been raised to believe that worth is measured by how much you can endure without complaint, that to struggle is to be virtuous, and that to prioritize your own well-being is selfish. As an adult, this becomes a prison where you chase pain instead of healing. You stay in toxic relationships because leaving would feel like giving up. You overwork yourself because burnout feels like proof of dedication. You deny yourself joy because suffering feels like a higher purpose. What makes this mindset so destructive is that it robs you of the very things suffering was supposed to lead to: growth, strength, and wisdom. Instead, you remain trapped in cycles of self-inflicted pain, mistaking endurance for progress. Over time, believing suffering is noble convinces you that happiness is not your birthright, but a luxury you must deny, leaving you worshiping your wounds while forgetting you were meant to live, not just survive. Obsessing over what-ifs. Obsessing over what-ifs is a psychological prison where your mind traps you in endless alternate realities, each one darker and heavier than the last. At its core, it is the constant replaying of possibilities that may never happen, the endless spirals of what if I fail, what if they leave, what if I make the wrong choice, what if everything falls apart. These thoughts grip you with such intensity that the present moment dissolves, leaving you living not in reality, but in imagined disasters. Even small decisions feel paralyzing because every path is haunted by a chorus of catastrophic scenarios that may never come true. This cycle often grows from deep-rooted anxiety, environments where unpredictability made vigilance necessary, or past traumas where something terrible did happen, and the mind now believes it must prepare for all possible outcomes. The brain convinces you that rehearsing pain will shield you from it, but instead, it only multiplies your suffering. You end up experiencing 1,000 imagined failures before life ever gives you one real one. What makes obsessing over what-ifs so destructive is how it strips away your ability to live. You lose sleep, replaying scenarios that never arrive, avoid opportunities because of dangers that don't exist, and sabotage relationships by fearing endings before they even begin. The what-ifs whisper that they are protecting you, but in truth, they are robbing you of joy, connection, and peace. Instead of preventing pain, they force you to endure it daily in your mind until the life you could be living slips away while you are busy bracing for storms that may never come. Disregarding your health. Disregarding your health is one of the most silent yet devastating psychological red flags because it convinces you that your body and mind can be neglected without consequence. At its core, it is the quiet dismissal of your own well-being. You skip meals, sacrifice sleep, ignore pain, and drown yourself in stress, telling yourself you'll deal with it later. But later never comes. What begins as small compromises turns into chronic exhaustion, illness, or breakdowns that could have been prevented if you had listened sooner. This neglect often grows from environments where productivity, caretaking, or survival overshadowed self-care. You may have been taught that rest is laziness, that your needs are secondary, or that pushing through pain makes you stronger. Over time, these beliefs harden into habits. You pour into others, chase success, or numb discomfort, all while abandoning the very foundation that sustains you, your health. What makes this so destructive is how it creeps in quietly. You tell yourself, missing one night of sleep is fine, ignoring stress is normal, or constant fatigue is just part of life. But the body keeps score. Each dismissal compounds, and eventually, the neglect catches up in ways you can no longer ignore. Panic attacks, disease, burnout, or emotional collapse. The tragedy of disregarding your health is that it often comes from believing you don't have time to care for yourself, when in truth, neglect steals more time than it saves. By ignoring the signals, you gamble with the only vessel you have to experience life. And the cruelest part is realizing too late that everything you sacrifice for means little if you are too broken to enjoy it. Dismissing your accomplishments. Dismissing your accomplishments is a psychological wound that convinces you that nothing you do is ever enough, no matter how hard you work or how far you've come. At its core, it is the refusal to acknowledge your successes, the instinct to minimize your efforts, and the habit of attributing your wins to luck, timing, or other people instead of your own strength. You cross milestones that others would celebrate, but instead of pride, you feel emptiness, quickly brushing it aside as though it were meaningless. Each achievement becomes just another box checked, another fleeting moment erased by the voice that whispers, "You should have done more." This pattern often develops in childhood, where recognition was withheld or where praise was always followed by criticism, teaching you that nothing you did would ever be good enough. Over time, this belief becomes ingrained, and as an adult, you measure your worth only by what you haven't yet achieved rather than what you have. Even when others admire you, you struggle to believe them, convinced they are exaggerating or blind to your flaws. The cruelty of dismissing your accomplishments is how it robs you of the joy you've already earned. You spend your life chasing validation, but reject it the moment it arrives. You keep running, pushing, striving, without ever letting yourself rest in the satisfaction of success. And the most painful part is that dismissing your accomplishments doesn't just diminish your past, it poisons your future, convincing you that no matter how much you do, it will never be enough to finally make you feel worthy.